You're listening to ThunderQuack Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to ThunderQuack Perfect 10. I am your host, as always, Michael Cohen, and I am so excited for this episode. We have a returning guest, our second returning guest. We had Joe return not that long ago, and now we've got. Listen, everybody else who's ever been on the podcast, I hope that you understand that this is no disrespect to anybody else, but this is my favorite guest. And I'm sure that she's going to be a little bit bashful about that and very, very humble about it. But this is my absolute favorite person to have on this specific type of a show because what we do on Perfect 10 is we talk about things that we love, but we talk about them in like a deep way where we can actually like pull apart, look at it and go, what, like, you know, see it from different angles and all of that sort of thing, and inspect what is it about it that makes this a perfect 10, right? And this individual, I think, is one of the best people on the internet at doing this, one of my absolute favorites, and that is Ty Black from Wit and Folly. Hi, Ty. Thank you for being back on the show.
Oh, oh, that's so sweet. Yeah. Oh, so I can kind of pat myself on the back a little bit for that because tomorrow's my birthday, so I feel like I can,
Excellent.
be a little bit, a
That's
little bit
even
cool
better.
about that.
That
I
makes it
know,
even better.
right? Right? I'm so
So
excited.
happy birthday then from me and everybody listening to this. Although podcasts are in liminal space, and so somebody could be listening to this 6 years from now. But
Yeah, true. Well,
we
on this
exist.
day.
Yeah, we exist outside of time and space for the listener. But in this moment, happy birthday tomorrow. Um,
Thanks.
and I this is great because we have unintentionally stepped into a trilogy of episodes because on this
Yes.
one we're going to talk about the movie Casanova, and this is another film starring Heath Ledger. The last episode, for folks who maybe haven't listened to the older ones, the last episode that Ty was on, we talked about A Knight's Tale starring
Yep.
Heath Ledger. So we will round this out with a third one because we're both Star Wars fans, and trilogies. That's it's just what you have to do, right? So
It's how our minds work.
yeah, it's impossible. It's impossible. Once you've done a second one, you have to do a third one to close it out.
Yep.
We will, but we'll talk about that later. Right now,
Yeah.
we're going to talk about the movie Casanova, which I
Yeah.
let's just jump right into it because we don't need any more rigmarole or anything like that because hopefully everybody's already listened to your Knight's Tale episode and they know all about you, and so we can just get right into Casanova. And I'm going to start
Yeah.
with the question that I always start with, which is for those who have no idea, which actually might be a bigger part of the audience than usual.
Mhm.
What is Casanova?
So Casanova is a 2005 film starring Heath Ledger, obviously. And it came about in a time when I think, especially with Heath Ledger's filmography, he was doing a lot of heavy stuff. He was coming off of things like Brokeback Mountain and Monsters Ball and like even, more heavier stuff than that. And he was like, oh, breath of fresh air. And in the film landscape as well, it was the same thing. It was like, it was a breath of fresh air, but also it was incredibly sexy and funny. And it had a very heavy feminine perspective in it. And especially in a time period piece, something that's set in in Venice, which is a real place, but it felt very fantastical. It feels very like the Venice that your mom reads about in her, erotic novels sort of thing. but with kind of this like new modern updated twist on it, and with people who are younger, youthful people, that are representing our, uh, leads. And it's just it's such a fascinating thing, I think, and it came out in such a interesting time where we could still get away with that sort of thing, but also the critical reception was not very good.
Mhm.
Um, Even the audience reception wasn't very good. If you go on Rotten Tomatoes now, it's, seems like a failure of a movie, which I think keeps people from watching it. But it's not something you should avoid. It's Heath Ledger, it's Sienna Miller, it's got this incredible cast, which we can
Oh
talk
my
about
god.
as
Yes.
yeah, it's amazing, and you shouldn't skip it because it hits all the right notes for that kind of film as long as you go into it knowing it's a romantic comedy, it's a time period, and it's just it does things with the history that I think are really fun and really, almost solves some of the problems with Casanova's true story, which is also
Mhm.
something I would like to touch upon. So
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
mhm.
Yeah. It's a very interesting film because of everything that you just said. Like when it was made in his career and also at that point in Hollywood, like it's a bit of an odd duck, right? Like
Yeah.
but the funny thing is that it actually um and in sort of the conversation that we're going to have in the context of having talked about A Knight's Tale almost a year ago, this is actually an incredible follow up to that. Like
Yeah.
it shares so much of the sort of that like wry wit and just sort of like the hey, yes, this is a period story, but there's a little bit of anachronism in here. There's a little bit of like hey, let's not ever address the fact that this is a story that takes place in Italy and everybody's speaking in British accents. It's like but it has we were talking about this a little bit before we recorded. It has like a very Shakespeare sort of lens over top of
Yes.
the whole thing, which Shakespeare loved Venice as a setting.
Mhm.
So like that makes perfect sense. So it's almost, to me, it almost feels like a modern reinterpretation of like a lost Shakespeare story, right?
Oh,
Like that
absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
that's the vibe, which is such a great like follow up, like I said, to A Knight's
A Knight's
Tale,
Tale,
which
yeah.
is Chaucer, right?
Mhm.
But is still like in that same we're in that same sort of zone, right? We're in that
Yeah.
same English literary zone. So with
Mhm.
these very like heightened arch characters, but really deep and meaningful themes that tie it all
Yeah.
together. So
Mhm.
it is funny because it feels almost like if you look at his filmography and you look at IMDb and sort of the progression of things, you can see that yeah, he was going on like this more like heading towards this more dramatic side of things, and then all of a sudden here's this detour back into the types of movies that got him there, which is
Mhm.
like A Knight's Tale.
Mhm.
And
Right,
so
and 10 Things, which was
yeah,
also earlier, right?
exactly. So it's like it's you almost get the sense that he did it because it was an opportunity to jump back into that. Um,
Mhm. Yeah, he said it in an interview, I think around that time when the movie was coming out, that he wanted to get away from some of the heavier stuff, and you could tell it was kind of messing with his head a little
mhm,
bit,
yeah.
because he was a very, like I mean, no one can deny, like, Heath was a very sensitive person. The press, like, was difficult for him, like, being in the spotlight in general is very difficult for him, but he was an artist first and foremost, so jumping into this kind of lighter role was something that he really needed as like a mental break from some of the other stuff he was doing. And he like says that himself. So and I just it that's why I think it's so nice watching a movie like this to know that the actor was in a good place, I guess.
Mhm,
Because it even though it's dealing with very like vulnerable stuff, like we're talking about a movie that has like a lot of sexual content, but it's all done very like lightheartedly and
mhm,
clearly the people who made it were having a fun time with it.
Yeah.
So I like that aspect of it as well.
It's also very interesting to me because it feels like a movie that's a like in terms of content and sort of the overall like feminist vibe of it, it feels
Hmm.
like something that's a little bit closer to contemporary now, although
Hmm.
at the same time there's a lot of content in this movie that I don't feel like would get made today, right?
No.
In the current climate, it like no studio would touch this. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting that it exists in that, because I think one of the things of like the critical and audience reception at the time is that it's actually ahead of its time, right?
Yeah.
Like if I think about where I was at in 2005 with my own personal journey with feminism, I wouldn't have received this movie in the same way as I do now.
Right.
Because even back then, it's so funny. I mean, you can listen to me on Quiver the Green Arrow podcast with my co-host Amanda back in like the early years of that, which isn't quite as far back as 2005. That's more like
Right.
2012. So it's not even
Mm.
that long. I guess it's over 10 years ago now. But um,
Hmm.
I was very well known for saying I'm not a feminist. I'm an egalitarian, because I needed to like equivocate that, because at the time like that's just like I think that's where we were, right? Like
Yeah.
for men especially, it's like, but to be a feminist is like, like that, like a man hating feminist, like that's what everybody thought of at the time, and I think
Right.
in
Right.
2005 even more so, right?
Hmm.
As opposed to now we say feminist and it just means somebody who cares about equality and
Hmm.
and you know
Yeah.
like
Fights for women's place. Yeah. Fights for
exactly, yeah,
women's place at the table. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how that's all changed so
yeah.
so much, so radically. Like, I mean, I'm similar to you. Like, I was very much radicalized, in a positive way, like online and through fandom and
Mhm,
whatnot. And
mhm.
I grew up in a very like conservative place, and I've become so different. I've grown up a lot, and I am an adult now with my own thoughts and stuff. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's so funny that like when I watched this movie, this was like even back then, even then, even college me, who that so I would have watched this probably this was already years after it had come out. I probably watched around 2010, 2011. And so when I saw it, because genuinely what made me watch it was Heath Ledger.
Mhm.
Um, I was obsessed with him, absolutely obsessed with him, and he died 2008, I
Yeah.
think. And that was like I got interested in his movies after he had
Mhm.
died. So I was kind of going on this binge of like, who was this person? Like, why is he so captivating on film? And just really watching all of his filmography. And I think this one was interesting for me because I was like, why don't they make more movies like this?
Yeah.
Like it just seems like such an easy jump because I think one of the writers for Casanova was also a writer for Stage Beauty, which is another one of the films I watched when I was in college that I was obsessed with. It's Claire Danes, and it's a phenomenal, phenomenal movie that's about women being unable to, well, not necessarily. It's about uh ugh, not even gonna go into it. It's a lot of gender bent type of
Mhm.
stuff happening in that movie. It's beautiful. It's amazing. And another one that he wrote, I think, was The Duchess. So, and this is just one of the writers. There was a lot of writers on Casanova. That's another thing we won't get into, but a lot of people touched the script.
Mhm.
And the one person that is credited with the original story of this script, this was her only screenplay. This was her only screenplay credit. And then everyone who touched it were all men who have other credits, who like basically fixed it for the screen. So, so yeah, it's like it's a really odd, like you said, it's an odd duck of a film. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense for how this was made, and like genuinely, for me at least, it was something that I needed at the time when I watched it. I really needed it. Didn't realize I needed it, and like I said, I really wish there was more out there like it.
Yeah, I mean, it is there's a catch-22 on that though, right? Because I think that movies
Mm,
like this are special because they're rare. Like,
that's
it's
a
one
good
of the
point.
it's one of those things of, like, every once in a while you stumble on something like this that has this sort of quality to it, and you're like, because I agree, I'm like, "Man, why don't they make more movies like this?" But then at the same time, it's like, well, because you just literally can't. Like, you just literally
Yeah,
can't, right?
yeah.
Um,
Was it
but
like
it
Adam Driver says, like, every movie is a miracle? Like, he said
yeah,
that one time about
yeah.
movies getting made, and it's true.
Yeah, well, and to say like this is the only screenwriting credit, of one of the writers, it's like, that's
Right.
actually not that surprising,
Mhm,
in particular because of the movie that it is, right? But
mhm.
even just in general, I mean, writing a screenplay is so hard. I It's one of two things happens. You write a screenplay, you put everything into it, and it becomes a movie eventually, and maybe that movie's not
Yeah,
what you originally had created as the writer, but it eventually gets there, right?
yeah.
And then you never get that opportunity ever again because you've poured everything you had into that one thing and you're just never able to follow that up, or you just have no desire to,
Mm.
or you're like a Roberto Orci and Robert Kurtzman type of individual where it's like you just pump out garbage after garbage after garbage regardless, right? And every once in a while the generic blah stuff that you're writing makes it into the hands of somebody who can, spin straw into gold, and
Mhm.
you get Star Trek in 2009, which, like, the same guys who wrote that are the same ones who are writing Transformers movies. So it's
Yeah,
it just, Hollywood makes no sense.
yeah.
Um
True.
and that's where I think, if we're going to talk about this movie in the context of, like, is it a perfect 10, what makes it a perfect 10, it is exactly this quality, because
Mhm.
I think that's why I defined that term for myself, right? Because
Yeah.
perfect 10 is not about, is this one of the best movies ever made? I'm not going to argue with anybody about that fact. It's like, I don't know that we need a Criterion version of this or anything like that, but there is there's an ineffable quality about art that sometimes it just connects and sometimes it just doesn't, and sometimes it can be for all of the very predictable and understandable and dissectable reasons, like something like Star Wars, where we can
Yeah.
we can really really pinpoint it and go, like, here are the things, and then we can actually distill that into a formula and make 1,000 movies every year exactly like it, and not all of them are going to be Star Wars, but you're going to get a bunch of stuff that's entertaining, right? Like
Yeah.
by distilling that formula. And then there are other things like this that it's just like, I don't know, this is just a perfect storm. It's just a perfect storm. It's very well written. The directing is totally on point. The setting and the art direction is all, like, pristine,
Yeah.
so perfect for this story. And then it just miraculously has this cast of people who come to play and absolutely understand the assignment from top to bottom. And that,
Yeah.
you just, if you had made this movie 5 years earlier or 5 years later, it might not have
Yeah.
come together in the same way, right?
No.
Because it's just
Yeah.
those actors at that time. I actually want to just read off the actors that I think are the most notable in this for everybody. So
Yes.
Heath Ledger, Sienna Miller, Jeremy Irons, Oliver Platt, Lena Olin, and then we get, there's a few other people, but we don't really know these actors that well. But then we get down the list, and then we've got Charlie Cox and Natalie Dormer, just like in supporting roles. And now we consider, like, Charlie Cox and Natalie Dormer would be like the
Oh, yeah.
headliners, right? And
Yeah.
we're watching the movie the other night, me and Crystal, and was like, Giovanni is so adorable and cute, and you just want to give him a hug. And I'm like, that's Daredevil, right? And she goes, what? I'm like, yeah, that's Daredevil. Like, the last time we saw him on screen, he was hooking up with She-Hulk.
Yeah.
So
I
it's like,
know. It's crazy. It's so insane, and he's become
yeah,
such a, like, that's I mean, excuse me, but he's a sex pot. Like, he
Yeah.
is
Oh,
so
absolutely.
hot. Yeah, and then you have, like, Sienna Miller who, we were watching the movie, me and my husband, the other night too, and he was like, "Oh my god, she's from," and, like, both of us were, like, getting tripped up on it. Finally, I looked it up, and I was like, Anatomy of a Scandal, because we had watched that show fairly
Mhm.
recently, and I was like, "Oh my god, like, she's huge too," and obviously, the guy who plays, Paprizio is from he's also in The Bear, which
Yeah.
blew my mind, but yeah,
Oh,
this
all
cast is
yeah.
incredible.
Oliver Platt is one of my favorite character actors. Like, if
He's
I
amazing.
didn't know he was in this. Like, I didn't look at anything before we started watching the movie. I just knew, okay, Heath Ledger and Sienna Miller. So I didn't know he was in it. I didn't know Jeremy Irons was in it.
Oh,
I had seen
wow.
something that I saw. Okay, Charlie Cox is in it. I think maybe I watched like a trailer or something like that. But yeah. So
So,
I
like,
knew that
every
Charlie
as
Cox
people
was
are,
going to show
like
up.
as people are, like, introduced, you're like,
Yeah.
"Wait, what?"
Oliver Platt shows up, and I like a giddy child, like I clapped. I was like, oh, 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 oh. I was so excited. And then immediately he just starts chewing the scenery, and I'm like, yes, yes, this is because sometimes Oliver Platt shows up in dramatic stuff and he's a very serious actor, and he's, don't get me wrong, phenomenal at that stuff too. But
Mhm.
when Oliver Platt comes to play, he comes to play. And in this movie, he is just like, allow me to be as silly as possible. And it just, he crushes in this role. And like,
Yeah.
by the time we get to the end of the movie, I'm so happy for the character. And it's
Yeah.
just, we're taking on such a journey with him. And then equally, Jeremy Irons shows up as the bad guy. And I'm just like, yes, Scar, right? Like, just,
Right.
I mean, if you want a villain, like, look no further. Like, this
Yeah.
is the absolute best person for this role. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's just such an embarrassment of riches, and it's, as an audience, you're just like, it feels so much like going to an incredible stage performance of something, and you're like, I can't believe all of these actors are in this
Yeah.
play, right? Like, it
Yep.
has that feeling to it, which just lends to that Shakespeare thing. So
Completely agree.
yeah,
Completely. It's so Shakespearean of that.
yeah.
Like, yeah, I couldn't have said that better. That's awesome.
Awesome. Let's jump into a little bit more of like the nitty gritty, because I know you have a lot of,
Yes.
notes you've prepped, which is one
I
of the things that
do.
I love about you. Uh,
I do, I have notes. I mean, I'm still such a nerd when it comes to this kind of stuff, so I do take notes.
totally.
So, yeah, I wanted to, like, at least give this a scathing quote, the scathing review, from Rotten Tomatoes, which is, like, the first thing that shows up when you Google it, honestly. Um, and it says this is the review. This says, "This frothy, oddly bloodless film does a disservice to the colorful life of the real Casanova." End quote. And I just wanna say, after I watched or after I watched this movie when I was in college, I was fascinated by, okay, well, if this person was real, like,
Mhm,
what was he like? So I ended up checking out the first volume of Casanova's memoir, in the library at my college, and it's very large, just the first one, of many, and I read it, and I was shocked. Like, I
mhm,
was, like, genuinely shocked. The real Casanova is the worst person you will ever have known ever. Absolutely horrible human being. One of the most notable things I think that he did, other than his, dalliances with whomever or whatever, obviously he slept with a lot of women. That was, notches on his bedpost type of reputation. But one of the things that he did that actually got him kicked out of Venice one of many times was he dug up a corpse and decided to kind of use it as a prank against someone that he didn't like. And that person went into shock and actually mentally broke and were never the same again.
mhm,
So this is the kind of person that he actually was. And he was very much, I would say, a loser. He did not ever really live up to very much. And people will hate me for saying this, by the way, because people believe that Casanova was this like great philosopher and whatnot. But if you read about what other people say of him, like alongside his memoir, you see very quickly that He was more of a con man than
Hmm.
not, and he was a talker, he was loud, and he had claimed at one point to have found the Philosopher's Stone. Um, just anything that was hot at the time, he claimed that he knew all about it, knew everything, and that kept him, funded, it kept him housed for most of his life, and at the very end, his last kind of words that he said were, "I lived as a philosopher, but I die as a Christian," which is really funny because he had lived so much of his life, uh, trying to not trying to, not be a moral character. He
Yeah.
was just but he realized at the end of his life that he really didn't amount to anything, and I think his memoirs are interesting because he did stuff that other people never would have dared to do. So that's what makes his
Mm.
legacy. But we have taken him as a character, and that name has become much bigger than him.
Yeah.
And I think that it is, uh, unfair to try to compare this film to like, the real Casanova, because if a movie was made about the real Casanova, it would not it wouldn't get by anyone. No one would pick that up. That would not be like he would be ugly, first of all,
Hmm.
so he wouldn't be attractive. So it's just it doesn't it works to say, "Hey, let's, like, write this kind of fantasy about Casanova as a name, as a legacy, more as like a Don Juan character,
Hmm.
and less about the actual man and the real life of this man." And I think the film that's, like, the basis of the film, and it has so much to say in that area from beginning to middle to end. Like, it's actually really brilliant the way it tackles that theme.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's an interesting component here historically, and I'm no expert on this time period, but like
Mhm,
there are many stories of Italy and Venice and like the Mediterranean sort of in this time period in the 1700s that like there's a lot of excess, right?
mhm,
Like this is sort of it's actually not that dissimilar from the time period that we're existing in right now, where you got a
mhm.
lot of very very rich people very living very opulent lives that the average person actually can't fathom, right?
Right.
And you create celebrity by virtue of people wanting to just like live through that person's experiences. And I
Yeah.
think that's where you so like I did not realize this was a thing that I would end up saying on this podcast, but I think that the real Casanova would be like one of the first reality TV celebrities,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
like like his actual persona is much more akin to that than it is to like you bring up Don Juan, which I think is the archetype that has been sort of ascribed to him after the fact, right? Like
Yeah.
over time. The name Casanova has, especially I think because like just listen to it, just say it a couple of times, and it's like it just rolls off the tongue. It feels beautiful. It feels like it should be this character that Heath Ledger embodies, and
Mm.
yet the real man was quite disgusting, right? Like he was
Yeah, yeah.
lecherous, not romantic, right? Like
Yeah.
which is such a big distinction, but
Mhm,
but that time period was actually like very well known for that type of behavior. Like it's he was notable in the excess of his behavior, but not all of the things that he would do. You could accuse so many of like the inner circles and like the noble people of that
mhm,
time of doing. It wasn't, I mean, like like
mhm.
like it's
That's
sort of
true.
touched on in this movie of like Venice is this weird, it's like Vegas, right? Like it's sort of like within Italy and like the purview of the Vatican, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
somehow exempted from its debaucherous behavior, right? Like for some
Right.
reason, because people need in puritanical societies, which like I mean we are in the era of the Inquisition, right? Like the Vatican is
Yes.
out there like just persecuting people for whatever they feel like just to assert power. And so you have this
Mhm.
puritanical ideology that's prevalent throughout the region, and so you have to have a pressure release valve, right? So that's why I say
Mhm.
it's like Vegas, where it's like, well, you can go to Vegas for a weekend and you can do whatever you want because it's all illegal. It's all legal. All of these things that you're not allowed to do, you can do inside these city limits or just outside these city limits, right?
Mhm.
Like you just go to Nevada, it's okay, everything's fine there. Um,
Yeah, like what happens there stays there kind of
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
And then you can go back to Connecticut and act like you didn't, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that Venice served a similar purpose in this time period. And so
Yeah.
he was just like he was the mascot of that, I think is what it
Mhm.
ends up being, is like he's the character that becomes synonymous with all of that. And
Oh,
then we
goodness.
romanticize this period
Yes.
because like when you look at the costuming in this movie, you look at the setting and everything. Crystal goes, "Should we go to Venice?" And I was like, "Well, first of all, Venice is sinking. Like it does not look like it anymore. Even in 2005 when they shot this movie, it's like
It was
this
sinking, yeah.
does not look like this anymore." Is like, yeah, I always love in Spider-Man No Way Home, they go not No Way Home, Far From Home. They get to
Yeah,
Venice and they get to their hotel, and their hotel, the first floor of their hotel is like a foot
it's
underwater.
underwater, yeah.
Um, and it's like, yeah, it's Venice is not as romantic as it once was.
No,
Um, and by
unfortunately.
all accounts, it smells horrible because like the canals are just basically sewage waterways, and like it just like so I'm like it looks real great on screen. It is not that in real life. There are other places that we can go.
Yeah, that's
I
true. That's
but
a good
but
point.
it but it's funny that like Venice does have that persona in the
Mhm.
same way that Casanova has that persona. So they're kind of one and the same.
Oh,
Um
absolutely.
so yeah, it
Yeah, yeah, like, Venice is so interesting because, like, real like you were saying, like, the real life Venice is like, shouldn't exist. Like, it's, like, kind of floating. It's like this
Mhm.
it's sinking. It's not floating anymore. It's sinking, and it has an expiration date, which actually makes it an even better, sort of setting for this kind of story with someone with, Casanova's legacy and whatnot, which, by the way, Casanova, continuously was kicked out of Venice over and over again. He just as in the movie, he grew up in Padua, which was on the mainland, and then he went into Venice, in adulthood, and I think he was kicked out of Venice at least 2 times, one because he broke out of prison, um, which was a fantastic tale that he wrote down, and he kind of lived off of the earnings from that folio for, like, a long time, but his reputation definitely preceded him. He was someone that people equivocated to Venice itself, and this was also in the age of Enlightenment, like the Renaissance and whatnot, coming out of
Mhm.
the Middle Ages, so people were looking to these more like modern anti-church kind of ways of living, an anti-church, anti-state, that whole thing, esoteric, practices. Casanova at one time joined the Freemasons, in France, and he actually moved up and he became like, grand master, whatever the role is in that society, and got involved in all of that kind of esoteric stuff. But like I said, he died a Christian, like he was still very traditionalist in that way, but he was representative of
Mhm.
the change that was happening in in that world at that time, which is why I think he has such a legacy. But yeah, so back to the Venice, as this kind of in the movie, especially, it's this place that shouldn't exist. And in the movie, I look at it as it's a world of the gods. So it is, in the beginning of the movie, the mother, Giacomo's mother, takes him to Padua, takes him out of Venice, and says, "You have to live here with your grandmother, uh, until you come of age or sometime or whatever." And the grandmother says, "Well, it's when I die." So then in adulthood, he moves back to Venice, and it's very much, reminiscent of, like, this almost like, like Disney Hercules type of
Mhm.
story where, he, lives in the land of the gods, but then he's expelled from the land of the gods, and he earns his way back in. We don't see that part in the movie, but he earns his way back in, and he becomes the god of love because his grandmother tells him when he was a child, "This is in your blood. This heat of love. It's irresistible to your mother." And therefore he takes that as, "Oh, well then that's me too. Like I have that within myself as well." So that's the way that he is able to cope with his mother leaving him. It's his way of kind of signaling to his mom, "Hey, I'm here. I'm in Venice.
Hmm.
I'm living to this fate that you've set me with, essentially. I've become the god of love. Like, please find me. Please come get me." So that's that is the initial beginning of this movie, and it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean it's very much about how our trauma defines us, right? Like
Oh, absolutely.
he's told by his grandmother, it's like it's not, this isn't your fault. She can't help herself.
Mhm.
She's prisoner to this thing in our blood, right? And then he takes
Yeah.
that. She says it as a warning, right?
Mhm.
It's a caution. And if this were a story, if this were an origin story instead of being like his most epic tale, um, we would have spent a whole bunch of time like seeing him sort of rebelling against his grandmother
Yeah.
and going down this path and denying that warning over and over and over again in favor
Mhm.
of like you say, like he's trying to get the attention of his mother, right?
Yes.
No, I am worthy of the adventure that you're on. You should have brought me with you, right? um
Yes, and that's so sad.
yeah, but it's not the point of this story. So we skip right over it. And it's like, listen, sometimes that can be a thing where it's like, especially with superhero movies, people will be like, "Oh, we got there too fast." With this story, it's like, guys, that's not what we're here for.
Right.
There's a tragedy in here that creates this character,
Mm,
but that tragedy isn't what we need to focus on. What we need to
no.
focus on is actually what ends up being a bit of a redemption, right? Like
Absolutely.
he's gone down this path and he is lost, and then he finds himself by the end of the story, right? So
Yes.
that's what we're focused on here. How he got to be lost. The only thing we need to know is that first scene. That's it. And then like let's
Mhm.
just skip right over. And I think a lesser film would have had that middle part, like you brought up Disney's Hercules, which it does. We start with him as a baby, and then we
Mhm.
see him as a teenager, and then we see him as a man, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Absolutely.
which is also Christ-like, by the way, and Superman.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Yep.
we skip over that in this one because it's not
Mhm.
important. It's not important this time, and it would have just, I think it would have pulled the movie down, right?
Right.
Like
Well, and
let's just get
also
right into it.
you can't do you could, but a training montage of Hercules bulking up to be a hero is
Yeah.
very different from a training montage of Casanova having to
Yeah.
learn what he needs to know.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think, like, hey, there's a story there to tell some other time, but yeah, it wasn't this one.
Yeah, no. This one we are immediately meant to be thrown into, and I love this because we're meant to be thrown into him as this lover, and
Mhm.
we get the first woman that we see him with is Lauren Cohen, who people would know from The Walking Dead,
Yeah,
another person who's got a huge career now, but that was nobody when they made this movie. Um
crazy.
and he is introduced as a heroic figure, but
Yes.
then like we take such a hard sharp turn the second that he gets into the university, and we're introduced to like who is actually the heroic figure of the story. um
Yes.
and we're given that juxtaposition, and it almost like it
Mhm.
stops you in your tracks. It's so, to me it's like so expertly done, because it's like, oh, here we're excited, he's gonna fornicate all over Venice, that's what this movie's gonna be. And then we just, it like stops in its tracks, and it's like this woman
Stop
pulls
dead.
off her mustache and is like, let me tell you why this sort of thing is bad. And feminism is the
Yeah.
thing, and what Casanova is doing is wrong, without ever saying it, but
Mm,
by being very very clear of like, he's living in opposition to actual enlightenment, and this woman is
right.
going to help him see the light, right? It's
Yeah, that juxtaposition that's presented very early is, like, so interesting. And I wanna go back to the just to the part where he's, like, running on the rooftops because that's
Yeah.
actually and I won't pull out all I promise I'm not gonna pull out all the real life, things, but I think this particular part is really interesting. Uh, the real life versus the fiction here is that the folio that he released about his escape from prison from Venice, from a Venetian prison, is actually an illustration of him running on the rooftops. And he couldn't just like crawl off the rooftops and jump into the canal because like the canals were pretty shallow. And so he didn't want to like, break his limbs. So he had to like get a ladder and, like, he went back inside and got a ladder and climbed down to a lower window and crawled into that window in order to escape, and it's, like, a very, very elaborate story, which is why it was so popular, but when they zoom out and they show Heath Ledger running on the rooftops, it looks like that illustration.
It's
So
the it's the equivalent to like in a superhero movie. They're like, oh, this is the image from the first issue
yeah.
from number
That's
one.
exactly
This is
what
from
it's
Action
like.
Comics. Look, he's got the car. I
It was like a weird
yeah,
Easter egg of sorts. I thought it was so weird, but I
that's
thought that
awesome.
was really funny. But yeah, so he runs into the university, he runs into Victoria, and one of the first things that they set out, which is the main theme of the film, which is air versus earth,
Hmm.
and it's traditionally and like the Christian, has the Christian tradition, women are representative of the earth and of flesh, and men are representative of the air and of spirit. And that comes from this like decades long of arguing between a lot of these Christian philosophers and
Hmm.
deciding like where's man's role and where's women's role and how do we interpret the Bible and like what it says about men and women and like what
Hmm.
is the place for these two genders. And she flips the script entirely. She says, "No, women are air, women are fire, and they let this contraption go up into the sky. We are the ones who belong to the air, and then men are earth, and they pull us down." So
Yeah.
she lets the sandbags loose, and then obviously, like Giacomo pulls down the balloon as well, which also illustrates her point. And it's a very funny, like straightforward, like this is what this movie is about. Pay
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah. Yeah. I say this a lot, and it's funny because it comes up a lot on Perfect 10 because of the types of stories that we're talking about. I love
Mhm.
it when a movie can clearly state its thesis without like stopping and looking down the barrel of the
Yeah.
lens and going like, this is what this movie is about. But when it can like artfully and cleverly present to you, this is the purpose of this story, right? So
Yeah.
like very much, yeah, flipping that script of like men do these things because women seduce them into no, men do these things because they have choice, they have free
Yeah.
will. And as a matter of fact, in this story in particular, the women are often the victims of the behavior of men and the
Yeah.
power that they wield, like
Mhm.
children, right? Like
Mhm.
so it yeah it, again, this these are the reasons why in 2005 I think this movie's not going to land with that audience, because the majority of the audience in 2005 is just not ready for that, right?
Yeah.
We're not ready for the Women's March in 2005. It's going to take a little
Mm.
while longer for us to get there. Um, as
That's a good
much
point. Yeah.
as that audience is more enlightened than an audience from 1995,
Mm.
let's go 1993, and a movie like Jurassic Park that has a couple of great feminist lines in it, but those feminist lines are like so tame compared to what we would consider feminist now, right?
Yeah,
um
that's true.
or it's
That's
just
true.
like, oh, man dies, woman inherits the earth, and then we can talk about sexism in survival situations when I get back, stuff like that. Or it's like just such like subtle stuff in that movie that sows seeds in individuals such as myself, to the point that I can quote them 30 years later.
Yeah.
um I
That's
but like,
awesome.
defining characters from, and then you go back even further 20 years before that to Princess Leia and the beginning of I think
Right.
feminist icons in film, right? Maybe not the beginning,
Right.
but one of the most notable, one of the ones that really like said, "Hey, wall, you don't exist anymore. I'm going to break through you."
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's just it is funny to me that it's like the stuff that's being said in the beginning of this movie is so it's so elementary to me now,
Mhm.
but I guarantee that in 2005, I mean, especially I was significantly younger, so not ready in that way as well. But just as a society, I just don't think that we were there yet, as much as a
Mm.
movie like this wants you to be, right? And some people were ahead of the curve and have to be in order to lead that charge.
Yeah.
Um, there there's an aspect of progressive thought where it's like there have to be people at the outset of it that are willing to make enemies and not have as many friends in order to get these points across, because you have to start somewhere, right? And
Yeah.
it's going to be unpopular at the time, which is so funny because it's like that's also what the movie is about. Is that she is so far ahead of her time
Mhm.
in saying these things, and like the ridiculousness of pulling the mustache off, and the I love later like this transvestite, which is a term that we would never use now.
Yeah.
I just know, but
But the
like
con the context is
but the
is
context is
accurate.
perfect
Yeah.
because like and this is one of those things where it's like it's actually kind of the beauty of the movie being made in the time that it was made, is that
Yeah.
the term transvestite would have been fine and acceptable in 2005,
Mhm.
whereas now we would never use that term,
Right.
and we have to like preface it of like, this is a thing, this is an outdated term. We say transgender, we would never say transvestite.
But
But
it was supposed to be like this, like, offensive, ridiculous thing that's in the
exactly. It's you
newspapers.
have to
Yeah.
take the context of the people who are using the word, right? And the people who are
Exactly.
using the word are looking down on this behavior, and especially in this context of like, oh, this person used this in order to gain access to a place where she was not allowed, right?
Yep. Yep, yep.
So in the context of things that we're talking about today in 2023, so interesting to me, right?
Mm.
So
Mhm.
it's just it's miraculous that this movie exists. It is,
I
because
know, I
now we
know.
can watch it, and it can hold such deep meaning in these conversations. But in 2005, yeah, the audience is going to be like, I'm uncomfortable with these things, and it's like, well, just I now I've brought up Jurassic Park already, and Star Wars has come up, and I'm going to bring up Back to the Future. It's
Yeah.
the moment at the end of the movie where he finishes the song and he's like, "Hi, you guys weren't ready for that, but your kids are gonna love it."
Yeah, no,
uh,
it's so true, yeah.
it's yeah, it's definitely one of those moments of like, oh, we'll get there. We'll catch up to this movie eventually.
Yeah, we'll catch
We have.
up, exactly. That's so funny. I love all your references.
It's the only way I know how to relate to the world. So,
Yeah, pop culture references, me
yeah,
too.
yeah.
I get it.
But before we get too far into the progression of the story, I just want to take a quick sidestep back to something that happens sort of in the background, and it happens a few times during the movie, and it's the puppet shows. I
Yes.
and this was the first piece where I went like, oh, this is in the style of Shakespeare. Like this was the
Yeah.
first thing, because it's the play within the play, right? And that's
Mm.
such a it, in so many of Shakespeare's works, it's prevalent, right? That like
Yes.
we have
Yes.
stories going on in the background that don't seem all that important, or that are sort of like conceits or constructs within the story, another layer, right?
Mhm.
In order
Mhm.
in order to get stuff across, and this is one of those ones of like we see, um without any character in the story needing to tell us who Casanova is to the people of Venice, because we're going to find out how the institutions of Venice feel about Casanova, but we need to know how the public sees him as well, right?
Right.
And I think that the important piece here, and it's funny because you give so much more of the historical context, and it brings this into more context for me, is that um, Casanova is allowed to do what he does because it entertains the people, right?
Yeah.
So although
Yeah.
many people would consider his behavior to be disgusting, they have these puppet shows going on where it's like, well, without Casanova, who's the scapegoat that we get to put all of our own behavior onto, right?
Exactly.
And that is the role that he serves, and he sees that, and he there is a moment with this first one where he's looking on to this, and the guy kind of is like nudging him of like, oh, that Casanova, and he's kind of like, he's disgusted with himself,
Mhm.
which is our first indicator in the story that he's ready to change, right? Like that
Yes.
there's a hero's journey that's about to happen for this character, because he's looking out into the world and going like, oh, this isn't actually who
Listen.
I think that I am, but this is
Yeah.
how everybody else sees me. So it's sort of, it's laying that groundwork, and it's important that we know that, and to use the
Right.
puppet show to do it is such a Shakespearean device of
Absolutely.
let's use this, let's use this piece of media within the media. It's what I do when I'm using Back to the Future and Star Wars to relate the story. It's exactly the same thing. I mean, like, that's why Shakespeare did it, because it was like let's use these things that people understand. You're at a play, so I know that you like plays, so I'm going to use a
Mm.
play to explain what's happening in this play, right?
Yeah.
Which is what
Yeah.
happens in Hamlet, is, but it's also serving a purpose in the story. It's all like, and it's just
Mm.
those layers. It's those layers that, like, those are the things that we that make Shakespeare, and I mean, we talked about it a little bit when we talked about A Knight's Tale and Chaucer.
Right.
Like, it makes them stand out among other writers of those periods, and why they've stood the test of time, right? Like, why they've become
Absolutely.
classical as opposed to just something that was written back then. So
Yeah.
yeah, I loved it. I was like, ooh, like this is what I'm here for. I think that scene happened, and I turned to my wife, and I was like, yes, this is my type of movie, 100%. And she's just like, okay,
Yeah.
whatever. She just likes the Heath Ledger of it, but
Oh, yeah, he's fantastic, yeah.
yeah, but I'm like,
Yeah,
oh, good.
there's a
There's
layer
stuff
here.
going on here that I can that I can get lost in.
Yeah, yeah, because there's a trope-heavy element of it, obviously, like you
Mhm.
said, like, we know we've seen this in other movies, but also it's incredibly Shakespeare, but there's something too that said, it's the first time in the movie where they make it very clear that there's another theme happening, which is, the people know Casanova, the people see this character, and they like him, like you said, they project a lot of their uh eh, failures onto him. They project a lot of their moral failures onto him, I think.
Mhm.
And he is essentially like Venice's moral failures, but also no one really knows Giacomo, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's a good way to kind of split those two. Is like Casanova is one thing, but Giacomo is probably that, because he doesn't take another name by the end of the film. So all we can kind of attribute to who he truly is his first name, which is something that not a lot of people use in the movie. They're usually referring to him as Casanova. So the legacy character of him being Casanova is what's being represented in those plays and the puppet show and whatnot. And no one really knows who Giacomo is. So that's it's such a cool thing.
Mhm.
All right. So further along in the story, so the Doge is so interesting because the Doge is it's another name for like, well, he would be referred to as a duke, but in the movie they call him Prince, which is interesting. But he's a representative of the Vatican, and he practically controls Venice. And he it's not like I think the in the real life story of Casanova, like there was a Doge. He didn't exactly protect Casanova. It was more of like he protected Casanova in as much as like the locals would have wanted to protect Casanova. Like if they were
Mhm.
on his side, he was on his side. If they wanted him gone, he wanted them gone, sort of thing. So that's who he was, and he tells him he which is the conflict of the film. You have to get a wife, you have to be on good behavior, or I'm going to expel you from Venice. So interesting as like a conflict. So he goes out and he is on the ground. I like to kind of look at levels a lot, especially when watching movies like this. When we're talking about, there's like a theme of godhood and the earth and the air and all of that. So whenever he kind of spots the statue of the Virgin Mary,
Mhm.
he is on the ground with Lupo and he's looking up at the people that walk over the bridge, and they're carrying the statue of Virgin Mary, and that is representative of Victoria. And it's like he's kind of always below Victoria. Like there's very few times where Casanova is actually above Victoria, and I'll kind of point those out. But the movie then cuts to Victoria in her window above everyone, looking down on like the peasants of Venice, and then Giovanni, who is directly across from her on level with her, who is looking at her from, from his window, looking down on everyone. So right away we kind of get these like equality leveling things going on, which I really find interesting.
Yeah, their stories are actually like incredibly parallel throughout
Yeah.
the film. And it, like, because they start as these virgins in the window looking down on the rest of the world, and everybody else is in the muck.
Yep.
um
Yep.
and there's like a we don't see it yet, but we're gonna find out that there's kind of a jealousy of that, right? Of like this thing that everybody else is considering to be holy, they consider to be a prison, right? And
Yes,
it's
yes.
but then later on in the movie, they're both going to break out of that prison at the same
Mhm.
time,
At the same time, in
with
different
the
ways.
in different ways, but with the same act, because
Yeah.
they actually both do the same thing in different places with different people.
Yep.
And then they see each other, and then there's the moments of like, oh, you've been here all along. Like the two of us have, like,
Yeah.
we've been, it's like fated, right?
Yeah.
Which is in parallel to the story of Fabrizio and the mother, right? Like it,
Yeah.
where it's like it's fantastic. I love, there's so much of this movie. This it's so funny.
It's
I
really funny, yeah.
Yeah,
There's a
I
lot of
just
parallels.
you suggested the movie, and I was like, "Yep, sure, no hesitation," because I trust your taste. Um, and then sitting through the movie, I'm like, "Oh my god, this is a movie that actually does define what a perfect 10 is for me, like for my personal taste."
I
But
love
it's
it.
one of those ones that like, it's funny. The same thing happened with Missy and
Roman Holiday.
Roman Holiday for me, because it was
Yeah.
like, this is a movie I never would have like sought out.
Yeah.
But now that I have seen it, I can turn around and go like, oh, this is such a me movie, and I'm
Mm.
so glad that I got to enjoy it, and that's the whole point of doing this podcast. It is
Yeah.
so easy for us to just do, like, and it doesn't make these movies lesser, but it's just, they're just easier to pull out
Mhm.
as perfect tens. To do the last one that we just did was Raiders of the Lost Ark with Cheryl, and it's like, of course, Raiders of the
Mhm.
Lost Ark is a perfect 10. It
Yeah.
it's we coined the term on that episode. It is actually probably the most perfect 10, because
Mhm.
like, I don't know that many people who have a problem with Indiana Jones, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
just so straight down the
Like,
middle of what everybody.
objectively, yeah, such
Yeah,
a good movie,
exactly.
yeah.
But a movie like this, similar to A Knight's Tale, similar to Roman Holiday, it's like, there are certain things about me as a person that are hard for me to define, but that I can relate to people by going like, well, these are some movies that, if you watch them, you could understand a little bit more about, like, about
I
me.
love it. I liked it when you said earlier, it's a very me movie.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah.
it feels
It's
like. This is a very me movie for me. This is on
yeah.
rotation for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny, 'cause like, Shakespeare is one of those things that, like, I'm not overt about it in the way that I am about like Star Wars or Ninja Turtles, or
Mhm.
like these things I think that are a little bit more stereotypical of a white, mostly
Yeah.
heterosexual cisgendered man in his 30s. I'm not in my 30s for much longer, but that's okay. We don't need to talk about that. But like the other things that we've talked about on Perfect 10 tend to fall into that category.
Yeah.
But then every once in a while we get to take these detours that remind me. It's like as I think I've talked with you before, and I've definitely talked with Marie Claire before. It's like I tend to surround myself with intellectual women. It's
Yeah.
like I did a podcast with my friend Amanda for 10 years, or I podcasted with her. We did multiple podcasts, but and the reason why is just because like there's a part of my personality, and it's the part that loves Shakespeare and these types of
Mhm.
stories that intellectual women tend to be sort of in the orbit of.
Yeah.
And so I find myself with those types of people, and then going like, ah, yes, this is why, because I get fed, like this other part of me gets fed that otherwise doesn't, right.
Yeah. There's also this element of, hyperfixations that girls and women,
Totally.
and it becomes like a thing, it becomes a joke in fandom, but it's so true that, like, a lot of young women, even older women, it's not necessarily an age thing, but we have hyperfixations. We get
Yeah.
stuck on this one thing for a while. I did it with Shakespeare. I did it with rock music. I did it with reality shows. I still do it with a lot of those things. And it's just like once you once you open yourself up to that during a certain amount of time, you get to know this whole world,
Hmm.
and you get to know it on this very deep level. I know even especially with women and writing fan fiction is another element to this, right? uh the amount of research that you do to write a fan fiction is insane, because like if you're going to describe the type of wine your character is drinking, you want to get it right. If you're going to describe how they smell and in what time period you're writing it, you want to make sure that you get that accurate, because like those little elements are important to the consumer. They're important to the person writing it, because they're typically the same person. So it's such a funny little world, I think, that should be cherished more. It should be talked about more, and this is 100% in it, because this is all of those elements wrapped into this one little film. This Shakespearean, the humor, the sexiness of it, the beautiful cast and all of that. Like it is such a women's fantasy,
Hmm.
but that also includes like very interesting themes and very interesting plot points that are like, oh, like like my next note is about the Sicilian citrus,
Hmm.
right? Which was like a huge thing back then, and it still is a big thing. They need an abundance of water to grow, and Italy was perfect for, tangerines and lemons and whatnot. And this was like the premier place to import your citrus from. And what do they put on the table in the Bruni's home but a little plate of citrus, you know? And Giovanni eats one. And you could look at this and go, "Oh, this is just, of course, Italy and citrus. I'm sure that's just a common thing,"
Hmm.
which it is. But also, there's a very few people in the movie that actually eat one of them on camera. And you could also look at it as the ambrosia of this world,
Hmm.
like Giovanni eats one, and later Pucci eats one. That's his name, right? Yeah, the
Yeah.
the bad guy.
Yeah. The bishop. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of to me to signify like they belong in this world. They belong.
Hmm.
They have eaten the nectar of the gods. They eat it casually. And whereas other people kind of avoid it, they kind of look at it and they kind of put it to the side, and they don't actually partake in the nectar. So yeah, that's so up my alley. I love that kind of stuff. But yeah, where were we?
No, I mean that's where we are, right?
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
I think we're getting into more of like um when Victoria is introduced, right? And the whole
Yeah.
his sort of courting of her that really literally has nothing to do with her, right?
Oh,
And
so true, so true, yeah.
it's
And
just it's transactional, right?
Right. So you picked up on the whole, like, obviously, like, the bird in the cage thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
walk us through that.
So I mean, yeah, when we're getting introduced to Victoria, and Casanova is there, sort of, making his intentions known. Her father is talking about her virginity and how chaste she's been and how he's protected her. And while he's saying all of this stuff, we're seeing her, like, sort of skulking in the garden, obstructed by many things, by the bushes and sort of the architecture or whatever. But then
Mm.
she kind of sneaks up and hides behind this bird cage, and it's this great moment of, like, such overt symbolism, as she's hiding behind this bird in a gilded, like in a literal gilded cage.
Yeah.
Let's bring another Disney animated feature metaphor into this. Like, we see the same metaphor in Aladdin, when Jasmine's
Ah,
talking about how she's been kept in the palace her whole life and never been allowed to explore or go out into the dirty muck of the real world, right?
yeah.
And she lets the birds out of the gilded cage, because that's her desire, is to be free, right? And
Yeah.
and Victoria's desire is equally made known, as she's watching intently, watching Casanova. And um I mean, like, she is not pleasuring herself, but she is making faces and moans as if she's pleasuring herself. And as he's sort of like, hey, like, listen, like, that's what I'm after, is I'm looking for a woman who's virtuous beyond compare, and I want to settle down, and that's who, like, now that that's what I want to do, that's what I have to do. But what he's really talking about is, like, he needs a symbol. This is why when he sees the Virgin Mary, he thinks of her, and he's like, perfect. I need somebody who's going to give me unlimited street cred as a now respectable man, right?
Yes.
And how am I going to do that other than, like, going after the most notably virginous woman in all of Venice, right? But in truth, she's like the horniest person in town because it's all pent up. It's like it's all
Yeah.
inside, right? And she, like, crushes the side of
The
the cage, and the bird flies out, and you're like, oh, she's loose now, right? Like, now,
Yeah.
just being in the presence of Casanova
Yep.
has tainted her.
Yeah,
So
because it's not
she's,
just him, it's, like, all the things he
yeah,
represents. Like,
yeah.
his name precedes him.
And that is a thematic element throughout the entire story of all of these characters, right? Is that
Absolutely.
it's all about identity and perception and notoriety and infamy and all of these things, right? Because
Absolutely.
it's him, Propizio, like the whole that we call that advertising. Such a great line. And I when Poochie shows up, and it's like, oh, my reputation has preceded me, and Bernardo
Mhm.
Guardi as a character,
Mhm.
both the character of, like, who he actually is, but who Francesca has created, this persona that she's created. It's everyone is lying. No one is who they truly say they are.
Yeah.
And it's this is one of the first times I think that that's really made known in the story, is that, like, Victoria is not, she is not this chaste virtuous woman. She's actually, like, she's a prisoner, right?
Yeah.
Her
Yeah.
father has imposed this persona on her, but it's not who she wants to be, right? she
Mm.
wants she wants to experience these things, as we all do, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with it, and I think that that's um one of the best things about the way that this story is told, is that it's very clear that, like, feminine sexuality is not a it's not an evil thing, which in movies it's usually the femme fatale. It's
Mm.
usually associated with danger and risk and mortality, right? But in
Right.
this story, it's actually like the bad guys are all pious, the heroes are all horny, for lack of a better way of saying it, right? like
Yeah.
like there it's
It's like
And
it's
they,
freedom to be of
yeah,
my own flesh and of my own spirit. It's freedom to be
yeah.
both. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's like, and especially like in a world, in a time period which very much reflects the time period that we're in, where these things are seen as like, you like, oh, like we don't talk about it, right? Because even
Mm.
as I use the word horny, it's like it almost feels like, ugh, can we talk about that? Can we say that on a podcast? But absolutely, we should be able to, especially talking about this movie. We have to, because it is
Mhm.
like this is where this story is living, right? Is
Yeah.
in this feeling that is a mix between our head, our heart, and our loins, right? Like it's where those three things intersect. Again, another thing that makes this such a Shakespearean story, because those were, especially like with his romantic plays and with a lot of his comedies, like that's what they were about, was this
Absolutely.
like this interplay between these three aspects of ourselves and how to balance them, right? Because
Absolutely.
like,
Yeah.
what's the difference between true love and lust, and then bringing in this intellectual side of it, of like how do you find somebody who feeds all three of those things? Because
Mm.
that's who you're supposed to be with, right? Is the person who meets all of
Yes.
those, or as many of those needs as they can, right? um
Yeah, and he says as much later in the script.
yeah.
Yeah, that's oh yeah, like there's all of that going on. There's these are these things that are constantly at war with each other. And that's why I think uh, when Giacomo and Francesca meet the first time, the funny thing that happens is that they're at odds with each other,
Hmm.
which they shouldn't be. They're actually incredibly similar. But that they should be in terms of the story, because the entire theme and the entire purpose of the story is that they are at odds with who they actually are, and therefore they're projecting onto each other of who they really are and not who they really want to be. And I think that one of the things that the film doesn't fail in, but I think one of the things that it struggles in really explaining is how Francesca is wrong. Um, because a lot of things that she says, a lot of these lines that she has,
Mm.
like, they turn out to be wrong. They turn out to be
Yeah.
inaccurate, and they never come full circle. But they don't necessarily do that with Casanova either. I mean, it's illustrated in what ends up happening. Actions are obviously louder than words, but uh it is so philosophy heavy, I think, in the beginning.
Mm.
I think now if we were to make this movie again now, it would have to be someone would have to say something
Yeah.
outright. Well, what is the solution? What is the philosophy? We can say it, like, artistically, like, what it came to, uh, which I obviously I have things to say about that later, but yeah, like, it's I wish there would have been more there, I guess. But, no, we don't have to go on the whole
Yeah. Yeah.
a whole thing, but yeah, I'm sure you
I think
understand what
I
I'm
I think that they're presented early on as the two sides of the extreme, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's there are it's a spectrum, right? Like we tend to want to put things into dichotomies. It's just human nature. We
Mhm.
want things to be black or white. We want to have a binary, because it's easy to define things, and it's our chimpanzee brains trying to determine, is that fruit safe to eat, or is it poisonous? Is it ripe, or is it not ripe? Like 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 it's the reason I say this all the time. It's the reason why we see in color, right?
Yeah.
That we see in color, because like evolutionarily it allowed us to distinguish non-poisonous ripe fruit from things that would kill us or make us sick, right?
Mm,
That's why we
right.
can see in color. And yet the fact that we can see in color is leads to us being able to create art and do all of these things, that it's like these
Mm,
unintended consequences of our evolution.
mm,
And so there's this aspect of it. You cannot just look at it as a black and white. We see in color, and this is a spectrum. She represents the extreme of the intellect, of the
right.
philosophy, right? And then he represents like living in passion and like sort of outside of that intellect, going by your gut, by your feeling, right? And then
Yeah.
he's also, because she's a foil for him, right? Again, to
Right.
use Shakespearean stuff. And then Poochie is introduced as the other foil, this the piety, who comes in and says, you know, like we have to live our lives in this way according to God, otherwise we're heretics. And yet the man is incredibly violent, and he's a
Mm,
murderer, and
mhm.
he's evil, right?
Yeah.
um but his flag is that of the church, and so he's considered a good and righteous man. But it's in juxtaposition to Casanova, who
Yeah.
is, he's not doing what he does to hurt anybody. He is hurting people. I mean, I think he learns
Mhm.
that over the course of the film, but that's never his intent. His intent is what he says, which is to sort of like live life to its fullest, and to experience these things, and to to share the experience with as many beautiful women as possible, is sort of his
Mhm.
ideology, right? um
Yeah, and they very well could have been like, "Oh, Casanova was the best at not only seducing but pleasuring women." Like, they could have taken it that to
yeah,
that step, but they didn't, which was
it's yeah,
brilliant
It
as a
it it
choice.
is it is another it is one of those things where there's a lot of showing and not telling, but
Yes.
sometimes we do actually need to tell every once in a while. So there's a lot going on in this movie that is there, but that is
Mhm.
not clear, right?
I
Because
agree.
when we start the movie, and he's feeding the fruit with the cream on it to the nun, and it's like she makes a comment, because it's like, well, you know, an eternity of damnation for one night with Casanova, was it worth it?
Mhm.
And she goes, actually kind of was, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
we get it, but it's like it's fleeting moments, so we're there, and we've moved on from it so quickly. But
I do take it as, that he actually wasn't, like, the best lover.
mm,
Even, like, in the scene where the only scene of, any sort of sexual content that we get that's, like, really explicit, it seems a bit chaotic. Uh,
yeah, yeah,
so I think that ultimately the movie was trying to avoid that because it was like, well, like, he and Francesca don't ever, like, do it in the movie or anything.
yeah,
Like, there's no like, he doesn't show her his pleasure skills. Like, he doesn't do anything to her, you know?
yeah,
They kiss at the end, like, that's it. But it's so beautiful because it's about partnership, and I think that they were avoiding this, like, because
mm.
they were basically saying, like, "Well, what if he's not actually, like, a good lover? Like, what if he actually is just, like, his reputation precedes him, and
He's just
that
prolific, that's all.
yeah, he's just prolific." And then
Yeah,
Francesca calls him out on that. She's like, "Well, you're just trying to
yeah,
make me a notch on your bedpost," type of thing,
yeah,
because
yeah,
that actually is what makes Casanova Casanova in the reputation area, not how good he is with women.
yeah. Well, and that's funny, because now that we discuss this, it's like, his other foil in the story is Giovanni, right?
Right.
And
Who is good
who
with
is like, that is the whole point, is that like with the brothel, it's like he, like, oh, what do I owe you? Oh, it's the don't worry about it, like we feel like we owe you, sort of thing. And like that's the moment that he becomes a hero in his own story, right? And like
yeah,
then
he becomes the god of love in that moment,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
I
funny.
yeah, that's funny. See, and this is another defining characteristic of a perfect 10, is that like the more we talk about it, the more we'll uncover, the more we
Oh,
learn about it, and the more
100%.
we figure out, like, oh, but what is going on here, right? Um,
Right,
that's
right, and
fantastic.
we can back up a little bit, but we don't have to cover everything because we pretty much we covered a lot of stuff in that.
Yeah, we did.
So, one of the things that okay, so obviously, like, they have the chaotic sword fight,
Yeah.
which is awesome. Is there anything you wanted to say about that or, like, their first meeting that we didn't
I mean, it's just, I think I already talked about the false identity stuff so much. It's but
I love
this
it.
is very much reinforcing that
Yeah.
that you know, he is already deepen his lies, and trying to become a person that he's not, and in pursuing that falsehood ends up in conflict with Giovanni, but Giovanni can't sword fight, so his sister takes his place, and
Right.
the two of them go back and forth, and it's representative of the back and forth that they're going to have throughout the whole film, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But they are also, he's met his match, right? Which is a
Yes.
term that we would use of like in sword fighting. It's like, oh, you've met your match, but it's also like it's a double entendre of like he's met his other half, right?
Yeah. Because she
And
bested him not only in the sword fight, but she also bested him in the moral and,
yeah,
like, word sparring. Yeah,
yeah.
it's so
But there's also the moment in the horse ride back where he's sort of like counterpointing her and is like, but
mhm.
what about this, like, is like it, like what is love, because isn't this also love,
Mm,
and like which comes up a few times in the story, right? And she's
right,
taken aback by it because I think that she perceives Casanova's actions as just like lusts of the flesh. There's nothing behind it, right? And then, but then
right.
when she hears him, I can't remember what his false name that he gives them is, but when he presents himself as this other guy and is sort of defending Casanova, he says things about Casanova's lifestyle where he's like, but I think this is what he's actually after when he's talking about himself in the third person, right? And she's
Right.
often like, well, I've never considered that, which is to your point of like she's so far to that intellectual philosophical extreme that she's kind of lost the forest for the trees of like she's talking so much about love and yet isn't actually talking about the experience of love, the physical passionate experience of love, which is
And
something that he's going to teach her, right?
yeah, because this is where she's wrong. Like, this is and
Hmm.
again, this she's not wrong in every aspect, she's only wrong in the aspect of, she doesn't like, he does in his way, and this is just in the movie world, he knows love of the flesh, and
Hmm.
that's what they're juxtapositioning, and she doesn't know love in any way,
Yeah,
and he is thinking of his mother, he's thinking of the love that he had for her, he's thinking of the fact that he is living in this world, this place, and he's doing these things because he is waiting for his mother, and
yeah,
he's also waiting for he's also saying, like we said in the beginning, like, almost calling out to his mother through these
yeah.
relationships.
There is a very and again, Shakespearean, there is a very Oedipal thing going on throughout this entire story, that
Definitely.
Francesca is the woman that he is destined to be with. And
Mhm.
her wild, curly auburn hair is exactly
Mm.
like his mother's.
Yeah.
When we first see her, she looks exactly like his mom.
Yeah.
It, it's there.
And
It's not open for interpretation. It's
no.
there.
It's
But
100% there. Also, his mother was
yeah,
always an actress,
yeah.
and by the way, his mother was an actress in real life, so
Mhm.
that was actually accurate, but the fact that he sees Francesca first on a stage dressed up as a man
Yeah.
is probably similar to how he saw his mother acting when he was a child. So, I mean, it's all there. It's 100% edible. But it's
Yeah.
funny because it sounded like I said edible. Etable, I don't it's too similar.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like, it's really funny, the fact that she is so different, but she is also, like we said, they're more similar. They
Mhm.
they they very much are like the same person in a way, and I
Yeah.
think that's what makes them great, like, fated lovers. Um and that they're like, binaries, right?
Yeah.
They're both and not binaries as in opposites, they're like a binary star. Like,
Yeah.
they're circling each other, and that also becomes a thing later, which is really cool. But yeah, they're more similar than they are different, and that's just something
Yeah.
they have to figure out.
I think they both seek the same life,
Mhm.
right? But they come at it from different perspectives because of their life experiences. But the thing that makes them fated to be together is that the only way for either of them to achieve that life is by being with the other, like, and learning from the other,
Yeah.
and the things about Casanova that at first she objects to are the things that she actually needs to integrate into herself, and
Right.
vice versa. in order for both of them to be well rounded and for both of them to actually achieve this thing that,
Mm,
whether they realize it or not, is what they're seeking, right? And it's
absolutely.
where we see them at the end of the film, right? Like
Yeah.
it absolutely is, outside of Venice, outside of the constructs of that society, able to just be, which is what both of them want.
Exactly.
It's what both of them want.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
they're both of their actions are rebellions against the constructs of Venetian society, right? They just,
Yes.
because one is a man and one is a woman, they're acting out in different ways. But they're both,
Mm.
it's fun. They're both very juvenile in that way, until they come together, and then like the scene towards the end as they're about to die and they look at each other, and it's like,
They're equals.
it's time to grow up in that moment, and that's when the
Yeah.
Deus Ex Machina comes in, right? So
Right, right.
it's but they have to get there, and they have to get there together. Like that's where it's, they're the opposite of star-crossed lovers. It's really
Yeah.
interesting,
Yeah, like, they
because
should have been together all along, and yet
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah. It's so
because
weird.
Romeo and Juliet only bring one another down until eventually both of them are dead, and it's the
Mhm.
fault of, again, society.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Definitely.
But like this is almost like a flip of that. It's the
Like, they're getting
opposite
in their
of
own
Romeo and
way.
Juliet. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
She kind of hates him when she first sees him, and it's yeah.
Yeah. They're both
Even
kind
though
of
they're,
hurting
yeah,
themselves, and that's keeping them from being with each other. Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. Alright, so let me God, we keep talking together. So much stuff.
It's
Trying to
difficult. It's difficult to stay, because so many of the themes are like throughout.
I
It's
know, they
difficult
go throughout.
to stay chronological with it, right?
I know, and
It's okay.
I was contemplated doing them based off a theme, and I was like, it's,
I think what
it's
will end
fine."
up happening is that, like, as we go through your notes, which are in chronological order, we'll at some point realize that we've met in the middle.
I know, that's what I'm thinking, that's why I'm, like, gonna skip some things here.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
like, to go off of the like, they're basically the same person. I'm just gonna skip forward to, like, the part where, like, he finds out or we find out, not Giacomo hasn't found out yet, but we found out in the movie that Francesca has a nom de plume.
Mhm,
So again, it's that whole thing of like, I want to be anyone but me because being a woman makes her lesser and she wants to overcome that. So that's like such an interesting parallel. And then we have enter Paprizio, who we've talked about a little bit. I had a little bit of a funny thing about Lard that I wanted to share that I think is so fascinating. But it comes off as a joke in the movie, but lard was actually considered like the number one, oil for especially country dwellers in like Italy. And it wasn't until the modern day when Italians learned that lard could cause heart disease
mhm.
that they turned to like nut oils and like olive oil instead.
Yeah.
Walnut oil was apparently a oil of choice, but also lardo di colonnata was uh, a type of essentially it was like pork fat that was like solidified and
Mhm.
sliced and served as if it were like carpaccio or salami. Um, and that's a delicacy in Italy. So it's kind of funny that they kind of push it as a joke, like, oh, it's
Yeah.
lard, but it was in the transitional period from being a very common oil to actually becoming a delicacy in the type of way it was served. So that's why he was such a rich man.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting. And then we also have the entrance of Pucci around this time, who has a military style buzz cut, which is something I didn't really think about until I watched it this time. I was like, wow, that's a very militaristic style of hair he has
Mhm.
there for being a wig.
Yeah.
Uh, but he also, like I mentioned before, he eats the citrus in Francesca's in her face, like very like arrogantly,
Mhm.
while he admonishes like Guardi's philosophy. He's just like angry about it and like eating it in front of her. Um And then in a scene kind of after that as well, we get something else from Pucci, which is so interesting, where he says, "It's not the tea I object to, it's the water."
Mhm, mhm.
And I find
Yeah.
this so interesting because I think that water is that element that we have been missing, which is funny because we're in Venice, but we have air, we have fire, we have earth, and yet we're in a world that is floating on water.
Mhm.
And Pucci in this moment says, "It's not no, it's not the tea. I object to the water." And that becomes a big part of the theme, as we continue on through the journey of the characters and where they end up. So something just to keep in mind.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I
anything yeah.
having read through your notes, I see exactly where you're driving at, and that's fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No.
Yeah, so, can we move on to Carnevale?
Yeah, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, so, they go to Carnevale happens, and obviously Giacomo has to wear, multiple masks because he's playing multiple characters, mistaken
It's so good.
identity.
It's another one of those pieces of overt symbolism where he's got the mask, he's holding it up with the stick, and then when we find out that that Victoria is also there, the masks flip and it goes from the white mask to the black mask. Because the white mask is this character that he's playing. He's come out falsely as he's put another false identity on top of his existing false identity because he's Signore whatever. I can't remember what the character's name was,
Yeah.
but
He
and he
pretends
said
to be Fabrizio
he's pretends to
and
be
yeah.
Propizio,
Yeah.
but as he's pretending to be Fabrizio to Francesca, he's actually like showing more of his true self than he's ever shown before, right? And
Mm.
so he's got the white mask, but then when Victoria shows up, he flips to the black mask because the black mask is Casanova, the
Mm.
persona that he's known as, which is not who he actually is, or not. It's not who he wants to be, and so it's like it's his past catching up with him. So it's like flipping back to the black mask, and I was just like it's so right there, but it's the sort of thing that Shakespeare would have written into the stage direction so that it didn't, so that nobody messed it up, right? So that like
Yeah.
in 300 years people would still be using the white mask and the black mask to make sure that this point is getting across, that
Yeah.
like one of these false identities is actually his true identity, even though like even Casanova doesn't realize yet that that's who he actually is.
No.
Because he's kind of he's because he's espousing the beliefs of Bernardo Guardi as
Mm.
Paprizio in order to win Francesca, not realizing that like this is actually what he truly believes. he just
Yeah.
he just has to like he's almost tricking himself into becoming the character that he's playing.
Mm.
It's
Right.
yeah, but
Right,
then but
yeah.
it's in as soon as he gets there, as soon as he's there and he starts to reveal his true self, and he's got plans obviously to sort of seal the deal later on
Mhm.
that are already in play for Carnival, right? Then his past is going to catch up to it. It has to. I mean, like this is the end of the second act romantic comedy moment of like all of the House of Cards has to come crashing down, right? Um,
Yeah.
so that everybody
Exactly.
can then actually truly reveal themselves.
Yeah, yeah, because that's literally yeah, that's the pattern. I
Yeah,
love it.
yeah,
I love it. Yeah, so, it's so absurd, the events that happen, so we'll kind of skip through some of these, but, so Pucci in the same time is, like, questioning Fabrizio, and he has a little
yeah.
dungeon, which, by the way, that actually existed, the Doge of or not the well, I don't know if it was in the Doge's quarters, but, in the quarters, I think, of, like, the head, like, law enforcement chief in Venice,
Hmm,
he actually had, uh cells either on his level or like right below his level of living space, and he tortured people there and also had cells there for kind of like higher class prisoners.
hmm,
Casanova would have been one of them, so that's accurate, which is odd as a historical uh little fact there. And so he finds out that Casanova is kind of pretending to be all these different people, the nom de plume is revealed and whatnot. So he goes so now everybody's at Carnival and everyone's there, and he's gonna be found out. So and Fabrizio also finds his true love and Francesca's mom, which is fantastic. I love that. And the balloon. The balloon is so interesting, like, because
Hmm.
it combines like, obviously, it goes back to Francesca at the very beginning, releasing her little hot air balloon in the academy, and, Giacomo says, "We're gonna get you one step closer to heaven." That's the quote. That's what he says in that moment. "One
Hmm.
step closer to heaven," because if you remember kind of some of the themes I've been touching on throughout, which is that they're already in the land of the gods. Like, technically, like, they're already really in, like, the equivalent of heaven, but he wants to take her further up, which is not a good thing, like, you can't go further up, like, that's the point. So, they dump the sandbags together, like, "Let's go on this adventure together." They go up, and everyone below sees them as gods. They see Casanova, and they see, like, his fiancée, but nobody really knows, like, no one recalls exactly who she is. Um, but you know, whatever goes up must come down sort of thing. They crash down into the ground, and they could have crashed into the water, but they don't. They crash into the ground. And again, this is that whole kind of uh conflict between the air and the earth and going up and going down. And I think the most significant probably like part of this whole sequence is the fact that and what brings them down is the she finds out in midair that he is not Paprizio and he is not any of the people that he said he is. He's actually Casanova, and that's just such an offense. So she knows how to bring the balloon down, so she does with fire or with putting out the fire, sorry. And the funny thing is that they circle each other in like kind of the way that it's portrayed. They circle each other like we were saying earlier about how them being binary stars, they're the same person. They're circling each other. They're like creating conflict where there doesn't need to be any because they are the same person. They're
Hmm.
fated to be with each other. And then they come crashing down and, it's like it's like in that moment when they're finally on the ground again and he's arrested. Because she says right before that, she says, that she wants someone to sacrifice their life for her,
Hmm.
which again, she's wrong. Like that's not a right thing. Like that's not something someone should say to a lover, a potential lover. But he does immediately after.
Hmm. Hmm.
And she looks at him and she's like, "Oh no, I messed up."
Yeah,
So,
well, there's a great moment as they're, in a traditional romantic comedy, you have the moment of like, you've been lying to me this whole time, and then they break apart at the end of the second act, and then the third act is it has to be the big, sweeping gesture in
yes.
order to win her, right? And
Yes.
in that moment, as they're doing it, it subverts that because she's like, "You lied to me this whole time." And he goes, "You've been lying to me the whole time. You're Bernardo Guardi and you're acting like he's this guy that you listen to, that you believe in. But these are your own beliefs the whole time. So, like, you come clean too. Like, if we both come clean, then we can both realize that,
Yeah,
like we're meant to be together. We've been doing the same thing to one another the whole time,
exactly.
right?" um
Exactly.
and then yeah, like they crash down, and then he takes on her falsehood as well,
Yes.
which is the thing that makes her realize the error of her ways, right? He's been aware of his faults since the beginning of the movie, right? When we saw the
Right.
puppet show, he's been like, yeah, there's something wrong with me. I don't know what it is though. There's something wrong with the way that I'm doing things, and the Doge tells him you got to do this. So that's the avenue that he pursues, only
Mhm.
to find out that was never going to be his absolution, anyways, right?
Right.
That's not his path. But for her, she's had this moral righteousness the entire time, and it's
Mm.
not until he points that out and then takes on her like he's already taken on her false identity and told Papricio that he is Bernardo Guardi. But when
Right.
he takes it on when it means his death, like that he is assured to be executed,
Mm.
she's like, well, wait a second. I've been
Y
wrong about him this whole time, right? Like
right.
this is what passion leads to.
Yeah.
Is what I wanted him to do, what I said that I wanted the man that I love to do, right? It's
Yeah.
it really like it's such a satisfying close to the second act. And the third act is very short in
Oh,
this movie. Like it's such a short third
yes,
act,
this is
but
a really short one, and I just wanna make like, a little note here because
yeah.
of what you just summarized, which is, brilliant. Uh, guess what other, like, 2 movies this happens in?
Uh,
A A Knight's Tale
yeah.
and
And
10 Things I Hate About You.
there you go. So there you go. I mean, like yeah. So we it's in the same way that these two are fated to complete this story in this way. You and I have been circling this Heath Ledger trilogy, and that's we
We
have
have
to finish the story by doing 10 Things I Hate About You. It's an inevitability at this point,
It's
right?
so fascinating how much they have in common in terms
Yeah,
of story patterns. I think we're gonna have a lot of fun, like, finding those similarities, so yeah,
yeah,
so
for
interesting.
sure, for sure. I
Alright.
Yeah, I get
So
that kind of leads us into the third act, right?
yes, it leads us into the 3rd act, which is kind of like it's more plot than anything else,
Yeah.
except for, like, the very, very, very end, right? So you have, like, Victoria goes to Poochie, and she's like, "Oh, he raped me," which, by the way, was an accusation against Casanova at one point. Uh, no one really knows if it's founded or not. I don't think it matters. I think he was a horrible person anyway, but
Yeah.
so he probably did. But Victoria then runs into Giovanni, which we discussed at the brothel, how he's a legend. He confesses his love for her. And then the trial comes, and Francesca decides that she's going to be right there by his side and defend him, uh, as in her, like, little getup, um, her little disguise, but also at the same time, she kind of comes out and says, "No, I am actually Bernardo Guardi," um, and that is enough for Giacomo to realize that she loves him too.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause, they both for both of them to say, he's like, "I'm Bernardo Guardi," and she's like, "No, but I'm Bernardo Guardi." Like, it's such a cute
Yeah.
little, like, "Oh, that's cute. Well, now you're both gonna die."
And it's a great moment. I love how quickly they trample on this. It's so good because again, it's
Yeah.
subverting the romantic comedy tropes of like she's giving this defense or whatever, and in the process of it, she's like he's lying to defend the person who loves him,
Mhm.
and like that's her confession to him of her love for him.
Yeah.
But also by action because she's doing the thing that he's doing for her, which she said that she required, and she's like, well, like what kind of a person would I be if I didn't? All of this is subtext, none of it's actually said, but
Right.
she
Right, right.
does it by action, and then in the moment that she reveals herself and and he's like, wait, you love me, like I love you too, and they kiss, but it
Mhm.
happens in the background of the scene, and it's their
Yeah.
first kiss, and it's we don't punch in, the music
No.
doesn't swell, nothing, because we're in the middle of like what could be their deaths or should be their
Yeah.
deaths, right?
Yeah.
um but because like this is actual true love, it's not romanticized,
No.
it's not grandiose, it's not it is a grandiose gesture, but it is but like the love part of it is real and not
Right.
lust or just like romantic comedy love. And in the
Hmm.
midst of this, Victoria and Giovanni have found each other, and so she recants on her thing, which is like he really should be dealing with the consequences of his actions, which is the life that he's led has led to this moment where she feels scorned and then says, all I'm willing to confess, like to I can't think of the word right now, but
Recant
testify.
or
I'm willing to
testify, yeah.
testify that he's done this
Right,
in
right.
order for Poochie to get what he wants. And then she recants on it, and he's like, well, it doesn't matter because I have all this written stuff anyways. And it's like,
Yeah.
so they end up going to the gallows together, right?
Yep.
But it's so she thinks that she's sacrificing herself to save him, but his past is caught up to him. It doesn't matter. Poochie wants him dead regardless, right?
Mhm.
Whether he's Bernardo Guardi or Casanova, it doesn't matter. It's all roads lead to the noose for him, right? So
Yeah.
um it's a bit of a, when you say like she was wrong, it's like we want, in a normal romantic comedy, this is the moment she's professing her love. She's got the boombox over her head, right? Like we're supposed to feel that, but then it's like, but she's wrong. Like this is incorrect, right?
Right, right.
So they're both gonna die. Now they're both
Exactly.
gonna die together,
Yeah.
and it's like it's at the same time that it's like, wait, but they can't both die. They're in
No.
love. Love
Mhm.
is supposed to conquer, and like we're just, but it's not. But that idea of love is not the right idea of love. Real love is
Mm.
different from what we see in the movies, what Casanova is purported to have been, right?
Mhm.
And so it's just
Yep.
it's very much like thumbing its nose at its own story
Mhm.
in
It
these
is.
moments, and we're all going like, wait, but what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Because the love
Yeah.
that's actually going to save them has nothing to do with erotic love. It's familial love is what's going to actually save both of them at the end of this
Yes.
story, which
So
it's which is real love, which is true
which
love.
is
That's
true
what true
love,
love is, right?
but that's what
um
they both have to experience, that coming
yeah,
from a mom, in order to be
yeah,
reborn, because they do die.
yeah,
Like, let's be honest here, they die.
yeah,
This is a hero's tale
yeah.
happening in the realm of the gods, and they both are executed in that moment. And
Hmm.
it's so interesting if you think about it from this point of view, because it was such a, like you said, it was a Deus Ex Machina kind of situation, and the mother shows up, but yes, they both are killed, and they are reborn, but they are able to leave the world, and their other, kind of, like, they pass down the torch
Yeah.
in order to escape, right? So yeah, like, there's some, cool
it
stuff that happens here.
The thing that I love the most about it is that like we actually haven't talked that much about hero's journey stuff on this episode, which is funny because it's one
It's
of the
so
things
heroes.
that you talk about so much on Wit and Folly,
I know, I
and one
think
of the
people are
reasons.
just sick of it.
Yeah,
I think they're sick of it.
but
I'm not.
there's the purpose of the hero's journey, right, is always to get the elixir and bring it back to the village, right? And
Exactly.
it's the piece that's missing from so many stories, so many modern stories, is that the elixir never makes it back to the village. We
Right.
never see that part, right? But in
Mhm.
this story, they find the elixir, and then it's immediately followed by an action sequence where suddenly everyone is proficient with the sword.
Yeah,
Everyone.
even Victoria.
Even Victoria, who
Victoria is
we've
like, right.
gotten nothing to indicate that she can handle a sword.
I
And
know.
Giovanni, who we already in this plot were told cannot do this. But
Yeah.
through the actions of Casanova in
Mhm.
this story, everyone has found their true love. They've
Yep.
found their true self, and they all are now like it's
Yeah.
visualized in this scene. They're all heroes. They're all heroes. Every last one
Yeah.
of them is Luke Skywalker. They all
Mhm.
have a lightsaber, and let's just have fun. Like it's just
Who
gonna be
cares?
fun.
Yes, who cares if they didn't all get a training montage?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
cares? Because that's not what this is
Yeah.
about. This is about
Exactly.
miraculous energy that is brought
Yeah.
to the group because of the heroic things that the heroes did. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
that's not hard to understand. It
No,
happens in so many
yeah.
films.
But it is one of those things that I think a modern audience looks at. And if you're not a Shakespeare nerd like the two of us are, and
Yeah.
going like, this has nothing to do with reality, you guys. The whole thing is a cartoon. The whole thing is a cartoon. From start
Yes,
to finish, this movie
exactly.
is a cartoon. But
Exactly.
But a modern audience looks at it and goes, "It's live action. It must be true, right? It must be fact." And we talk about this on the Indiana Jones episode. I talk about this all the time. It's my favorite
Right.
thing in the Indiana Jones films. The difference between fact and truth, right? Because
Yes.
this story is true, even if it's not
Mm,
factual.
mhm,
It's a true story,
mhm.
right? Because all of them now being able to fight their way out is they have all discovered this inner strength, and that inner strength is manifested. It's the 1700s in Venice. It has to
Yeah.
end with sword fights, you guys. It has to. It's just an inevitable.
Yes,
It's
it
another
has to.
inevitability.
It has to. Oh, one
and
thing
and
I also
everybody just
yeah.
can do it, like, and that's fine.
Yes,
It's fine. We
it's
don't need a
fine.
plot to tell us that. It's actually about the spirit of it, not about the mechanics of it, right?
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, one of the other things I wanted to say was going on this kind of like mythological bent is that the mom of Giacomo also she is the true goddess of Venice, right? So
Hmm.
she is the one who expelled Giacomo in the beginning of the story from Venice. And she told him what to do. He did that and she saved him. She kept true to her word. So when she shows up, she is actually the true goddess, meaning that she has control over Venice until she leaves again, which is, like, so interesting from, like, a control point of view. 'Cause she goes up into the box with the important people and whatnot,
Hmm. Yeah.
and she has her lover do exactly what she told him to do, and he says, "Oh, it's the people's birthday, and no one should be executed, and da da da." And so he plays out that script and she doesn't have to do anything. She is eloquent, she is or not eloquent, she doesn't say anything. She's elegant and she sits there and she is, absolutely just this
Hmm.
royal goddess figure.
Yeah.
And it's when she's like she reveals herself and you look I mean like honestly I lost my mind when I watched it again because I was like, "This is so beautiful," and how they're presenting her as this true goddess, as in a way, a foil to Victoria, because Victoria, is like this virginal princess
Hmm.
of Venice. She's supposed to be the kind of this ideal woman for Casanova, and therefore the ideal bride of someone like him, someone who has that reputation for Venice. And but then she comes along and she's like, "No, I am the true mother of Venice. I am the goddess of Venice." And so she saves him and she saves all of them. Which and it almost like kind of like resets the clock. It almost resets the myth. It's so interesting from a mythological kind of perspective. But so yeah, so they have like this like weird epic sword fight, which actually, fun aside, I uh was in a Shakespeare company when I was in high school, or yeah, when I was in yeah, no, I was yeah. Yeah, so when I was like in high school, college, like I was in a Shakespeare kind of troupe type of thing, and I did sword choreography. And this scene was, like, on my radar for, like, years. So
Hmm.
I was really into it, and I actually, like, choreographed scenes based upon some of the stuff that happened in this one because it was just so cool. It was just so much fun and so
Hmm.
silly, and it translates really well to the stage in terms of, like, how stage combat goes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just, like, a really fun scene. So they all get onto the boat, and they have to get out, and they have to decide, like, what's what is the fate of every character, right? This is like establishing like what where is everyone going to fall? What are their roles going to be? And I love this. So Victoria is held back by her father, and she has to say anyway because it's already established that she's a goddess. And then uh Giovanni decides that he's going to stay and he's going to take the role as Casanova. He's going to become the god of love. And Lupo says, "I have to stay with my master."
Hmm.
But that's not before Lupo. who saved the balloon takes the material that made the balloon out, and he rigs it up as a sail, which saves all of them, which is such a cool thing. So Victoria becomes kind of this goddess of love, and Giovanni becomes kind of the god of love. They kind of live this weird non-monogamous lifestyle and whatnot.
Hmm.
But I did want to emphasize such an interesting way to kind of wrap up the whole theme of the earth versus the air, which is that the solution to this whole thing is to take to the sea. So they rig up the balloon, they set sail to leave Venice, and they leave Venice via sailboat on the water, and it
Hmm.
rains.
Yeah.
So you have like multiple like water symbolism going on. And water is the great equalizer because it brings the air down and it brings earth up. It kind of like disrupts all of these things, but it flows. And Francesca and Giacomo are both like all of these elements. They're fire, they're earth, they're air, and they're both water ultimately, but they're both water together in a
Hmm.
way because water is where they can be themselves together. It's what kind of pulls them down or pulls them up, and it allows them to become equal with each other. And I just think that's such a cool kind of resolution to the whole story
Yeah.
because it cools everything off in a way.
It's I also so the Christian iconography is throughout the movie, right? And it's like the
Yeah.
Catholic Church is they're the villains, right? I mean, for good reason. I mean, like the Catholic Church are the villains,
And during
in
that
history,
time,
but
they
also
definitely were.
well, I just mean quite literally in the world, the Catholic Church are the villains. That's my opinion. That's not necessarily Ty. I don't want to speak for Ty, but that's my opinion.
It's
They're
probably my opinion too, but
they're the bad guys.
yeah.
Parading around as the good guys, and they in this movie they are also that. So it's interesting
Yes.
that Christian symbolism isn't really used a lot in this, except like in subversive ways, like seeing the Virgin Mary statue and a lot of the stuff that Pucci does is like
Right.
there's a lot of like oh signing the cross and stuff like that that happens. It's like these are the bad guys though, right?
Right.
But it's very interesting that at the very end of the film, we've been told by the church that God looks down on the actions of all of these characters as sinful and disgusting and debaucherous and blah blah blah, and we're
Right.
supposed to believe that that's how God feels. But then at the very very end they are baptized, right? Which in Christian symbolism
It
to be
cleanses.
yeah, to be immersed in the
Mm.
water, your old self dies, your sin is washed away, and you're reborn as a new person. And so the water comes down, but it's not normally baptism as a rite is it's a ritual that we do where a person who's been appointed, whether they're a priest or whatever, has taken you into the water and they dunk you forcefully and then bring
Mm.
you back up out of it.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with God, everything to do with man. Baptism,
Yeah.
in my opinion, as someone who was raised Christian,
Yeah.
baptism is a construct that we added. And
Oh,
actually,
yeah.
if you really listen to Christ, baptism doesn't have to happen, right? And he's
Oh,
actually
yeah.
like his cousin John the Baptist was actually a foil for Christ of like to show that like this is actually wrong. This is actually bad. This practice is actually incorrect. We're all equal, whether like the highest, the lowest, no matter what you do, and all sins are
Right.
forgiven because of what Christ does, right? In
Right.
actual Christianity. So take that for what it is. That's my interpretation. That's how I live my life.
Hey, I was actually raised Baptist, so that's really funny
There
that
you go.
yeah, and
Um,
I agree.
but rain in this symbolically is a true baptism because it's coming from the heavens, it's coming from God, it's nature.
And it's also below them as well, right? So it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like
well, and they're
this.
they're floating on it as well,
Yeah,
right? But like that
exactly,
water
exactly.
coming down from the sky, from nature, from a force outside of man
Mhm.
is is symbolizing that like no, their sins are actually being washed away as they leave Venice. They
Exactly.
leave their
Yes.
old selves behind, and they are now free to live the lives that they've always wanted to live, which is the lesson that the mother already knew. And
Mhm.
it's why she couldn't come back until now, right?
Yeah,
She
yeah.
couldn't return to rescue him until he was ready. And he's not
Mm.
ready until the two of them look across each other with these nooses around their necks and go, well, I guess that we die together. Right.
Yeah,
Like, and
yeah.
it's in that moment that then she's able to show up, save the day, and the Deus Ex Machina, which is like the the God literally intervening,
Yep,
right?
yep,
Um, in
exactly,
order to save our
exactly.
heroes, it's like it all has to happen. And then the next time that we see them, they are living humble, happy lives because they have each other and they have family, and they've both found these things that they've said the whole time that they're looking for, which is true love.
Uh, so this is, like, the best ending ever, like,
Mhm.
this is how I want all of my enemies to lovers to, like, end.
Yeah,
It's just such a wonderful ending. And also, like, you had brought up the fact that, like, the play within a play thing,
yeah,
um, and how there's, like, 2 moments within the movie where they show this, and it's like, oh, like, Casanova, like, this is who he is on the stage, and a puppet for him, whatever, and Francesca at the end, she's like, "Oh, wait, who writes your plays?" So she becomes their playwright, and on the
yeah.
top of in the epilogue type of thing, they have, like, on top of the theater wagon, a new play by Francesca Bruni, and you can see it's starring Giacomo. He's right there. He's learning his lines, she's helping him with the script, and it's, like, the first time in his life where he is playing a character, but ultimately he is himself. He is
Hmm.
able to be himself, which is an actor. I think it's so beautiful. It's not explicit,
Yeah.
uh, but it is really beautiful that he is able to just be himself, dedicating himself to Francesca, and also being able to kind of wear those different masks as a talent in a way.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's just so cool.
Yeah. And meanwhile, the character of Casanova that he was sort of saddled with because of that trauma, he's left that behind, but it persists
Yeah.
with Giovanni. But Giovanni chooses to take on the character, and
Mm.
so he's able to shoulder it in a way that Giacomo didn't. Right? He was
Mhm.
like the bird in the cage, and like Victoria, like he was a prisoner of this persona that he thought he had to create because his
Yeah.
trauma made him a prisoner of that. And he gets away from it, and that persona isn't the thing that was holding him back. He was holding himself back, right?
Right.
So Giovanni's able to take that persona and able to live inside of that. And Victoria is also doing the same thing. She is also she's still that symbol of virginity. She's still in white at the end of the movie, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and yet the two of them are free to be their true selves, even though they've taken on these personas in Venice, which is another interesting
Which
piece at the end.
I mean, again, it just shows that they were always meant to be gods and goddesses
Mm,
of their own. Like, they always were meant to stay in this world, and they were always meant to kind of be these higher beings in a way.
yeah,
Because the very last shot we have of them is them floating in the canals, which we
yeah,
know, like, in terms of symbolism, the water is the great equalizer, and they both look at different people while they're
yeah,
sitting next to each other in the gondola. So that was their way that they found equality with one another, but they're also each have their own power. He has a power as Casanova, and she has a power as Victoria, who has a reputation again, which precedes her. So it's so interesting how it all comes like full circle in a way. It's
yeah.
so brilliant.
I it is so wonderful to like break down a movie like this that is like a hidden gem that most people have disregarded or completely
Yeah.
misinterpreted, and but for us to sit here and go like, yeah, but look at all of this, like look at all of this, because so much of what Shakespeare did in his time was considered like, oh, this is just trash. This
Yeah,
is not
that's
good.
true. Yeah, it was
And
for
it,
the masses, yeah.
yeah, it because it was ahead of its time, and because it required multiple engagements in order to understand, right?
Mhm.
Because of the layers and the symbolism and everything. It's like, yeah, you look at a story like this, and it's like this is definitely in the spirit. I mean, like it's funny how so many things try to be Shakespearean. They try
Mm.
really really hard, but something about this story and the way that it's presented, it just like from the very beginning, you're just like, yeah, if you know what you're looking for, it's just so obvious. It's
Yeah.
so obvious. And so then you can just ride that throughout the whole thing. And once you have that perspective, this is one of those things with the prequels. I bring it back to Star Wars to close this out. Basically,
Yeah.
is that like the prequels were seen by the general audience as more Star Wars movies, but that's not what
Mm.
George wanted to do. If he wanted to make more Star Wars movies, he would have kept going after Return of the Jedi, right?
Right.
But that's not what he did. He stopped at Return of the Jedi and went, well, that type of story is done. I'm done telling that story. And he went and he told some other stories. And then he eventually decides to come back. And when he decides to come back and tell the story of the prequels, they are Shakespearean. The Old
Mhm.
Republic, the whole setting, the way that everybody speaks,
Mm.
or at least is supposed to speak, it's all like the problem is that George, I don't think, ever let anybody know that that's what he was doing. He never let the audience in on it. I
Mm.
don't think he let the cast in on it. I think that some of them understood innately, and that's why Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine is just one of the greatest performances in the history of film. Even
Mm.
though a lot of the stuff that he does in the movies is so arch and so out of place, it's like it's out of place because you've got Natalie Portman and Hayden Christensen trying to act,
Mm.
right? They're trying to just make a movie, as
Yeah.
opposed to you've got Ian McDiarmid and you've got Ewan McGregor who are showing up to do Shakespeare, right?
Right.
Along with several other actors. And you've got Samuel Jackson, who is by no means a bad actor, right?
Mm.
Samuel Jackson
Yeah.
has given some amazing performances in his career. And yet
Yeah.
he is as wooden as and flat as a piece of set dressing in
Yeah.
those movies as Mace Windu because he's not in on it, right?
Mm.
But if everybody can be in on it,
Right.
if the costume designers, the cinematographer, the directors, the writers, the actors, if everybody is in on it, you end up with a movie like this that is absolutely a perfect 10 by virtue of that, because it's just
Absolutely.
it knows what it is. It sets out to tell a certain type of story and it delivers on that type of story. And it's not going to be for everybody, right? Like
Mm.
this is one of those ones that it's like there are a lot of movies that we've talked about, a lot of and TV shows and stuff where I can go like, yeah, like everybody should be able to enjoy this Indiana Jones, right? Everybody should be able to
Yeah.
enjoy Indiana Jones. It's pulp fiction, right? Like that's why
Yeah.
it's pulp.
Mm.
But this is one of those ones where it's like, I'm not going to recommend this to everybody, but the people I recommend this movie to, I know are going to love it. I
Yeah.
know they're going to love it. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why like you suggested it and I just didn't even question. I didn't even question because I was like, well, if Ty loves it, there must be something to love. And so
Mhm.
yeah, I was like at the very least it'll be fun because of Heath Ledger, and
Yeah.
it'll be another piece of that. But then, like I said at the beginning, Oliver Platt shows up and I'm like, oh boy, here we go. Right. And then Jeremy Irons, and I'm like, this is the type of movie that this is. Yeah, I mean, Oliver Platt presents himself when he enters, and it's like it is very much like there's stage direction there. You can read that in your Cliff Notes
Yes.
version of the play, where it's like Paprizio enters stage left, and then it's like he enters. Shakespeare would have used a specific word, and that
Yeah.
specific word would have had like 3 sentences to explain to a ninth grader what that means. But what it means is he enters in a way that is like he's grandiose and he's ridiculous, and we know
Yeah.
immediately this character is the clown, right?
He's
That's
he
who
is kind of
that's his role.
he is kind of a Falstaff type character, which is funny because Falstaff in Shakespeare was one of the most, like, beloved characters,
Hmm.
but he was also someone to make fun of,
Yeah.
and I think that shows it's truly the charm of
It
Shakespeare is what they are playing with. Yeah.
Yeah, there is an aspect to that I feel like I have to talk about before we close out of
Yeah.
Fabrizio's character, which is there are a lot of fat jokes made at his expense in
Yes.
this movie, but there are two things to this.
Yes.
Oliver Platt's
I
in on the joke.
know where this
He
is going. Yes!
he's absolutely in on the joke. It
Yes.
is also it's in the writing. It is text, not subtext.
Mhm.
That's what she's into.
Yes!
She
Yes!
says it. Your father was I don't like thin
Your
men. Your
father was
father was a bigger
huge.
man and oh
Yes!
like you get a moment of it and then when she sees him, she's like, "Oh boy, I like this guy." And
It
then it's also a source of power. So although it's a
Yes!
joke, he lifts Poochie off the ground and is like, "You have no authority over me."
Exactly.
And it's just like
Exactly.
and it's because he's a Goliath, right? Like
Yeah.
he's a giant among the rest of these regular men.
Yeah.
And nobody sees him for what he is, but it's in the moment that Francesca's mother sees him and
Mhm.
goes, "I love you for who you are." Then
Yeah.
he's able to draw from that power and he's able to go like, you can't tell me what to do. You everybody else might be scared of you, but I'm not." And I'm just
I
like,
I
I
love
love
it.
that character so much because
I love it.
he owns it. He owns it. And that's why
Yeah.
so we're allowed to laugh at the lard joke. We're
Yeah.
allowed to laugh at more yeah, a little bit more on the belly, right? Like we're allowed to
Yeah.
laugh at that stuff because we know that he's also laughing at it, but that
Yeah.
it's also going to be he's going to be redeemed by it and he's going to save the day because of it, right?
Oh,
Like it's
absolutely. Well,
so
the best lighted scene of the entire movie is the scene where Paprizio and Francesca's mother are in the back of the gondola, and because
mhm,
they're both in the back and there's no one in the front, the entire thing is lifted up out of the water
yeah.
except for the back, and the other gondola has to kind of like go under the bridge of their gondola in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is incredibly well lit. It's a beautiful like, it's very odd that they did this, but it's a
Yeah.
beautiful scene. It's coming off of the falling action of what occurred before, but what I'm just like, "This is such a weird movie." Like, I cannot believe this was
Oh, it
made.
just it filled me with such delight in that moment
Yeah.
when she looks across the dance floor and sees him, and I'm like,
Ugh.
"Oh, she's in love. She's actually gonna be in love." Because she's been talking the whole time about like, "Well, we have to do this. It's for, like, for our position in society and blah, blah, blah."
Duty.
She's got
It's all about
duty
duty.
all these
Yeah.
bad reasons to marry, and
Yeah.
it's all implying it's a this is her marriage, not
Yeah.
Francesca's, right? It belongs to her, not to Francesca. And then it literally belongs to her. And I'm just like, it's so beautiful. It's
It
such a
is.
great way to do that. You speak
It
of lighting. There's a moment that I also want to call out in this movie that
is.
was so good that I made Crystal watch. We rewound it and I had to watch it two times.
Oh, really?
When Poochie is introduced and he like in the scene where he's talking to Francesca, so he's talking to everybody. He's addressing the whole room, right? And
Uh-huh.
he's lit evenly. Everybody's lit evenly.
Mhm.
So we're all in the same space. Everybody's going back and forth, but then this tete-a-tete sort of starts between the two of them, and he makes his way around everybody else, and he steps into the light from the window, and as he steps into the light from the window, it throws him into stark contrast. So he's got bright it's actually he's in terms of cinematography, he's actually blown out on one side and he's too deep in the shadow on the other. It's
Yep.
to somebody who doesn't know what they're looking at and who isn't paying attention to what that means symbolically in the story, you'd be like, that's a really poorly lit scene. But I'm watching it and I go like, what they just did in that moment. And I bet on film it probably looked better. What I mean is like projected back on film. And in
Mm,
2005,
right.
it would have been a crapshoot of like, is this going to be a digital projection or actual like 35 millimeter?
Mm,
Because it wasn't
true.
until like probably about 2008 that most theaters had fully converted, and that was because of 3D, right? Which
Right.
Avatar did that.
Mm,
So in 2005, like this would have, for most people, they would have seen this on actual film, in which case that contrast would have been softened just a little bit. When we watch it digitally and we watch it on our LED screens and all that, it's more than it would have been.
yeah.
But it's the purpose of it in the storytelling from a visual, like from a cinematography standpoint, is that it tells us immediately, not that just that he's the villain of the story, but that he is truly evil, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody else is existing like on even footing in like a real, not a real world because it is a cartoon, but like they're all occupying the same space. He
Mhm.
suddenly is like, he is a devil in that moment
Mm,
because of the
mhm,
way that he's lit. And although he is standing in the light, because he moves into the light, he doesn't move into the darkness,
mm.
because of who he is, because of the position that he holds in the story as a representative of the church. He stands in the light, but he's so far into the light that it's actually a bad thing, right? And so like
Right.
he's standing so deep into the light from that window that it's revealing his true self on the other side,
Mhm.
which is that he's in darkness. Like he is actually completely in darkness,
Right.
because he's actually an evil person. He is actually the devil. And I was just like that I was like, that camera, it's not a camera move, it's all staging, it's all blocking, right?
Yeah.
But that moment of cinematography is so well executed that like I had to experience it twice. Like I was like, I got to go back and watch that again. And Crystal got mad at me because she was like, she hates it when I do stuff like that, because she just wants to watch the movie. But I'm
Yeah.
sitting there going like, but did you see that? Because it's the sort of thing that I envy in a
Yep.
filmmaker, where it's
Yep.
like, oh my god, that's just so brilliant to
Yep.
have him just step
It
into
is
the light,
brilliant.
not into shadow. Because most of the time we would have a character in the shadow step into the light to like show them as a hero or something like that. But
Yeah.
it was used to subvert that, of like he's stepping into the light to show that he's bad.
Yeah, well, that's the rest it tracks with the rest of the film and what they're doing with
Yeah,
elements, right? It's like,
yeah,
well, light is not necessarily, good and dark is not necessarily evil kind of thing. Like, and I wish they, in a way, again, this goes back to like if I made this film today,
yeah,
I would probably do this differently. But the fact that like they're playing with all these elements, that is so interesting. And the next
yeah.
time I watch it, I'm gonna have to look out for that because every time I watch it, I do find different things in it. Like for example, last time I really watched it was I found the amount of time they really gave Giacomo's mother when she came back and like how she
Mm,
was kind of lifted up as this goddess almost floating like she floated when she came down those stairs like it was just such a
hmm.
beautiful scene and I just cried and I cried. I was like, oh my god, this is so beautiful. But yeah, every time I watch this movie I find different things, so that's so cool. That's so
That's awesome.
cool. I love it.
Cool. I think we did it. I think we did
I
it.
think we did it.
I That's awesome. I think we've covered everything that we needed to cover for sure, and
Yeah.
I think we've made the case that this movie is absolutely a perfect 10. Um,
Yes. Definitely. We did done do it.
yeah,
As my
I
husband would say.
where can people find more of your brilliant insights?
Oh,
My
thanks.
words, not your own,
So
but
sweet.
absolutely brilliant insights. Where can people find that on the
Oh,
internet?
I appreciate it. I've been in a creative dry spell because I have too many things to catch up on and it's summertime and it's difficult. But I am on YouTube. I make YouTube videos if you guys don't know under Wit and Folly. My next one is going to be about As Above So Below, which is a horror movie which is totally out of the realm of what I usually do, but it has an alchemical nexus which is interesting. So I'm excited about that. And obviously I'm on Twitter under black underscore TYM. And I also under at underscore or I don't say this a lot often.
Yeah.
At wit underscore folly is my kind of like YouTube, Twitter. So yeah, you can follow me there.
Awesome, and absolutely do all of those things, and go back if you haven't listened to our episode talking about A Knight's Tale and you enjoyed this one.
Yeah.
Then definitely go back and listen to that, and look forward to the inevitable conclusion of our Heath Ledger trilogy as we talk about 10 Things I Hate About You at some
Yes.
point, probably in the next 12 months. I
Yeah.
This has been awesome. It is always such a pleasure. So thank you for being on the podcast again, and I hope everybody else enjoys this episode as much as I enjoy getting to record with you.
Aw,
I
thank you so much.
Yeah, it's always awesome. Our next episode is going to be another returning guest. See, I've cycled through all the people, not all the people, but I've cycled through a bunch of the people that I want to have on, and now I'm going back to other people. Our next episode is going to be uh, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from the 1990s, and Missy is going to be coming back to talk about that with me, because it turns out that she's a huge Ninja Turtles fan. I've discovered this. We were talking on Twitter, and she was like, "I love Ninja Turtles," and I was like, "There's a new Ninja Turtles movie coming out." So I want to talk about the perfect Ninja Turtles movie, which is the 1990s one. So yeah, that'll be our next episode in August. So look forward to that. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to Mutant Mayhem, which is going to be an awesome movie, that you can just tell by the trailers that it's going to be so good. But yeah, we're gonna take a trip back to 1990 and enjoy what I think is actually one of the best comic book movies ever made. So look forward to that. And of course, you can also find me over on Patreon, patreon.com/ThunderQuack, with a Off the Record, which is the exclusive ThunderQuack podcast that we do. I do it. It's just me. It's usually just me talking to myself, but it's where I talk about all of the sort of more current pop culture stuff, and that's available to all Patreon supporters, as well as so we kind of changed things up a little bit recently, where there's only one tier on Patreon now, and all rewards are available to everybody who supports. So it's $5, and you get every other week you get an episode of Off the Record, and then you get this podcast early, so you would have gotten this on Tuesday instead of Friday, if you are current and listening as they release. But you also get on the Friday the Perfect 10 Pop Quiz, which is our trivia podcast that accompanies every episode of Perfect 10, where Tim Dipple takes you into 10 trivia questions about the topic. So I'm very interested to see what trivia questions he has for this episode. I think that they'll be great. He does such a good job with that. The best thing is that, like, I don't give him the episode beforehand. He's off researching and doing his stuff to write his trivia, like, while I'm editing this, basically. And so he goes off and he does his thing, but every single time it comes back together, and it's like, you asked 90% of the questions that have been asked on Perfect 10 Pop Quiz coincide with topics of things that we discussed in the episodes. It's just it's magic how it always seems to work. So I'm really curious with this one, because I think this one is probably our most, like, out there episode so far. Maybe Laura Olympus is a little bit more out there, but the one that I did with Marie Claire, but it's pretty out there. So I'm interested to see how in sync the trivia questions are with what we talked about. But that's a
Cool.
reward that is just for Patreon supporters. So if you want to get that a Perfect 10 Pop Quiz, then that is the way to get it, is over at patreon.com/ThunderQuack. And I'll also just note that that I've just this week we'll be concluding our Obi-Wan Kenobi retrospective that me and Marty Alleman have been doing on Force Perspectives. So we've done the first 5 parts, and we'll be concluding this week, actually, with or we will have, by the time this episode is out for the general public, we will have concluded our 6-part retrospective on the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, which has been a lot of fun to dig back into that a year later. So go check that out. And yeah, we've got Ahsoka coming up at the end of August, so look forward to that on Force Perspectives. And that's it. That's everything that I'm going to promote right now. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you again, Ty, for being on this episode. I can't wait to have you back. And I will see you guys on the next episode. ThunderQuack Perfect 10 is hosted by me, Michael Cohen. Follow us on Twitter at ThunderQuackPod, on Instagram at ThunderQuackPodcast, on Facebook at ThunderQuack, and join us on Discord at thunderquack.com/Discord. Support the podcast by heading to patreon.com/ThunderQuack to get early access, bonus episodes, and the ThunderQuack Perfect 10 Pop Quiz. ThunderQuack Perfect 10 is part of the ThunderQuack Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.